33 cover-ups, 5 centuries, 1 royal family, from vanished heirs and forged letters to secret lovers, Nazi sympathies, and sealed vaults of untold wealth. This isn't history, it's damage control on a dynastic scale. They wear crowns, but they rule with silence. What you're about to hear is the story they've spent generations trying not to tell. Because in the House of Windsor, truth isn't lost, it's buried. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can inherit is the secret. This is 33 biggest British royal cover-ups. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed for more deep dives into the shadows they don't want you to see. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Toronto? Let's see who else is up uncovering the crown. 1. The Princes in the Tower, 1483. They were meant to be kings, or at least one of them was. Edward V, just 12 years old, and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury, aged 9, were lodged in the Tower of London for their protection. That's the official version. It always is. The reality? 2 royal boys vanished from a fortress that functioned less like a palace and more like a politically convenient oubliette. And history was kind enough to call it a mystery. That's the first cover-up, giving it a polite name. When Edward IV died suddenly in 1483, the throne passed to his son, Edward V. But before the coronation could even be scheduled, the boy king and his brother were whisked off to the Tower by their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard claimed to be safeguarding his nephews. A month later, he declared both of them illegitimate. Days after that, he crowned himself King Richard III, neat, tidy, and bloodless, on paper. Except for the silence, the unnatural kind. The boys were seen playing in the courtyard for a time, and then they weren't. No funeral, no procession, no royal mourning, just nothing. The tower gates stayed closed, and so did the mouths of everyone who might have known the truth. Years later, bones were found beneath a staircase in the tower. 2 small skeletons. No names, no plaques, no real answers. Just an assumption. These must be the boys. Of course, Richard III got the blame. Shakespeare made sure of that. Hunchbacked villain, snarling lines about horses and kingdoms. It's dramatic and convenient, but convenient rarely means correct. Tudor propaganda machine, meet national memory loss. The problem is that everyone had motive. The Tudors needed the boys dead to solidify their own claim. The Woodvilles, Edward IV's Queen's family, were ambitious and ruthless enough to orchestrate a disappearance if they felt cornered. And Richard himself? His path to power was clear only if the boys were out of the picture. Permanently. Historians have tiptoed around the mystery for centuries. Why? Because it's a case that refuses resolution. Every piece of evidence feels second-hand, politically tainted, or discovered conveniently late. Even the bones, reburied in Westminster Abbey, were never conclusively identified. The royal family has, to this day, denied permission to exhume and test them. Imagine the PR nightmare if they did, and found something, anything, that confirmed the worst. So they don't. Mystery preserved, monarchy protected. But the most chilling part isn't what was done. It's what wasn't. No investigation, no inquiries, no demands for justice, for 2 missing princes. Because if the crown is the hand holding the knife, who dares call it murder? And so the Tower of London stands, visited daily by tourists snapping photos beneath the windows where the princes were last seen. Cute, grim little plaques, gift shop miniatures, and carefully worded placards. A palace of polite amnesia, but perhaps that's the real function of monarchy. Not memory, but erasure. Not legacy, but the illusion of continuity, polished and performed. And if erasure worked once, it would be used again. it was used again. Nearly a century later, another royal scandal emerged. This one involving a queen, a murdered husband, and a set of letters that may never have existed. 2. Mary, Queen of Scots casket letters, 1567. It starts, as many royal scandals do, with a man found dead under suspiciously convenient circumstances, and a woman blamed before the ink on the accusation had even dried. In 1567, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, the second husband of Mary, Queen of Scots, was discovered lifeless in a garden near his lodging at Kirklefield in Edinburgh. His house had just exploded rather theatrically, yet he showed no burns or blast wounds. Instead, he was found a short distance away, fully dressed, with signs of, well, let's just call it an untimely exit. The explosion, it seemed, was not the cause of death, but the curtain drop. Someone had wanted it to look dramatic, and someone else, someone very powerful, had the motive to ensure it looked like Mary had commissioned the performance. Not long after, a curious little collection of documents emerged. 8 letters, a few sonnets, and 2 marriage contracts, allegedly written by Mary to James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, the man widely suspected of orchestrating Darnley's death. The papers, now famously dubbed the casket letters, for the silver casket in which they were supposedly found, were presented by Mary's enemies as irrefutable proof of her guilt. Proof that she not only loved Bothwell, but had conspired with him to remove her inconvenient husband. It was, if you believe the narrative, passion weaponized into treason. But here's the problem. One the English crown was in no hurry to clarify. No one really knows if Mary wrote those letters. They surfaced at precisely the moment they were most politically useful. Mary had fled to England seeking protection from her rebellious Scottish nobles. Instead, she was detained by Elizabeth I, her cousin, her rival, her political mirror. The English court used the letters to justify keeping Mary under lock and key, without a trial, without a conviction. And while Elizabeth's government held inquiry after inquiry into the matter, they never once allowed Mary to defend herself in person or examine the original documents. Conveniently, the originals vanished. What remains are copies, translations, and transcripts, many written or edited by men who had every reason to see Mary discredited and neutralized. Historians remain bitterly divided. Some argue the letters are forged or tampered with, mixing real phrases from Mary's hand with malicious insertions. Others believe they may have been fabricated entirely, cobbled together by Scottish lords eager to justify their rebellion, and English officials equally eager to eliminate a Catholic claimant to the English throne. After all, what better way to poison a queen's legacy than through her own words? Words she may never have written. For centuries, the debate has ping-ponged between patriotic romanticism and forensic skepticism. Mary, the tragic heroine, versus Mary, the femme fatale. It's a question of authorship, sure, but more deeply, it's a question of narrative control. If the letters are fake, then history was authored not by the monarch, but by her enemies, and dutifully preserved by a British state all too willing to forget its manipulations. The most damning silence, though, came from Elizabeth I herself. Despite the damning evidence, she never permitted Mary's formal trial. She simply kept her imprisoned for 19 years. That kind of caution doesn't come from certainty. It comes from fear of what Mary represented and of what the truth might demand. In the end, the letters achieved what swords could not. They destroyed a queen without ever shedding royal blood on English soil. And they showed just how easy it is to weaponize paper when you control the script. Of course, Elizabeth I would learn the lesson better than anyone, for she too would become the subject of whisper campaigns, secret liaisons, and carefully managed mythologies. The Virgin Queen, they called her, radiant, chaste, untouchable. But behind closed doors, the court murmured about something far more human and far less convenient. 2 mysteries down, 31 to go. And trust me, they only get stranger from here. If you're still with us, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what else they've tried to bury. and drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you in London at tea time or somewhere halfway across the world deep into the witching hour? Let's see who else is unraveling history in the dark. 3. Elizabeth I, Virgin Queen. Myth. She ruled like a god, dressed like a saint, and managed her public image like a modern PR strategist on a caffeine drip. Elizabeth I wasn't just Queen of England. She was the mother of spin. Her brand? The Virgin Queen. Untouched, unmarried, and above all, unthreatened by the complications of intimacy. It was a tidy package, wrapped in pearls, poetry, and Protestant stability. But as always with royalty, the truth is more complicated and more carefully buried. Let's start with Robert Dudley. Childhood friend, master of the horse, constant shadow. Their relationship was no secret at court, though its exact nature remains one of the most carefully ambiguous entanglements in royal history. He had private chambers near hers, was granted extraordinary access to the Queen's person and thoughts, and was her near-constant companion for over a decade. Ambassadors gossiped about their closeness. Poets romanticized it. Courtiers were uncomfortable, and not because they were prudes, but because they understood politics. Elizabeth may have been queen, but she was also a woman on a political tightrope, and her throne depended on appearing unattached, unpossessed. When Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, died under highly suspicious circumstances, falling down a staircase in a manner that looked more staged than accidental, Elizabeth's reputation could have easily shattered. It didn't. Not because people weren't suspicious, but because no one wanted to push too hard. The court smoothed it over. The Queen distanced herself, and the scandal that could have broken her rule became one more entry in a growing list of carefully managed silences. Then came the foreign suitors, dozens of them. Kings, archdukes, princes, dukes, all dangled like decorative chess pieces to buy time or secure alliances. Elizabeth flirted diplomatically, negotiated like a broker, and then, somehow, always, declined. It became a performance. The Virgin Queen, so devoted to her people she could never marry a man. It was a powerful narrative, but it was also a necessary one, because the alternative was chaos. A husband would mean a co-ruler, a child would mean a successor, and both would weaken her personal authority. That's not to say there weren't rumors. There were plenty. About secret pregnancies, hidden lovers, and royal bastards passed off as noblemen's sons. Some claimed she wore heavy cosmetics to hide more than just age. Others whispered about medical conditions or accidents that made her incapable of bearing children. Still others speculated that she was intersex, or that she'd once been a boy swapped with a girl in a childhood tragedy. A theory so bizarre it sounds like satire, until you realize how many people genuinely believed it. The Elizabethan court was paranoid, imaginative, and deeply invested in preserving appearances. Elizabeth herself fed the myth. She dressed in virginal white, gave speeches about being married to England, and cultivated an image somewhere between saint and sovereign. But behind closed doors, she was sharp-tongued, deeply insecure about her fading beauty, and prone to jealous rages when her ladies-in-waiting dared to fall in love. She ruled like a man, but was constantly forced to justify her femininity. The Virgin Queen wasn't just a title, it was a shield. After her death, the court didn't rush to set the record straight. There were no memoirs, no intimate revelations, no sudden exposés. Just silence, and a continuation of the myth. Because history needed Elizabeth to be more than a woman. It needed her to be a legend. And legends aren't allowed to be messy. But in the corners of history, behind the embroidered portraits and flowery dedications, there's a shadow. A woman who ruled with ruthless intelligence, surrounded by men who adored her, feared her, and perhaps occasionally touched more than her hand. But we'll never know for certain, and maybe that's the point. Because the cover-up wasn't just about one queen's chastity, it was about power. Who holds it? Who threatens it? And what must be sacrificed to keep it untouchable? And speaking of power that dares not speak its name, her successor had his own secrets, and his own favorites, male ones in fact. And while Elizabeth buried her intimacy beneath lace and legend, James I flaunted his attachments with royal nonchalance, just not in the official record. 4. James VI of Scotland, I of England, and male favorites. When James VI of Scotland ascended to the English throne in 1603, becoming James I of England, he inherited more than a realm. He inherited a stage, one built by Elizabeth's cult of personality, poised for the next act of royal theater. But James wasn't interested in continuing the Virgin Queen's delicate ballet of appearances. He preferred something a little more direct, a little more personal, and, as the gossiping pens of his court made clear, a lot more scandalous. From nearly the beginning of his reign, James surrounded himself with a series of young male courtiers who seemed to enjoy not only his royal favor, but also his intimate company. The first and perhaps most notorious was Robert Carr, a handsome, uneducated Scot whom James elevated rapidly through the ranks, first to Viscount Rochester, then to Earl of Somerset. To say Carr rose through the court quickly is putting it mildly. It was as if James had found a new hobby and decided to make him nobility. As for Carr's qualifications, well, he was easy on the eyes and agreeable to flatter. Then came George Villiers, later the Duke of Buckingham, charming, cultivated, and alarmingly ambitious. If Carr was James's infatuation, Villiers was his obsession. James referred to him in letters as "my sweet child and wife," a phrase that would have had the censors howling had it not been written in the king's own hand. The two traveled together, dined together, and even shared a bed, though defenders were always quick to clarify that shared bedding was common among men of high station. Yes, and so is plausibly deniable affection. James's public displays of affection with Villiers raised eyebrows not only in England, but across Europe. Diplomats wrote coded letters filled with insinuation. Satirists had a field day. The court whispered, chuckled, and made pointed jokes. One anonymous pamphlet described Villiers as having climbed the king's bed to climb the ranks, a line that somehow survived the censors, perhaps because it was, inconveniently, too accurate to be dismissed. Of course, none of this ever made it into official records. The court historians were remarkably restrained when it came to documenting James's personal life. His letters were selectively archived. His poems, many written with a tenderness that strays well past the bounds of platonic friendship, were conveniently forgotten. Over the centuries, academics danced around the implications, using words like intimate, close, and politically advantageous. Anything, really, to avoid saying what everyone knew and few dared record. The irony, of course, is that James wasn't even trying to hide it. He once declared openly before Parliament, "I love the Earl of Buckingham more than anyone else." That wasn't coded. That wasn't poetic. That was James, out loud, unfiltered, and unbothered. And the cover-up wasn't orchestrated by him, it was orchestrated by history itself. Because monarchy depends on myth. And James's myth was supposed to be one of kingly wisdom, biblical knowledge, and divine authority, not long poems to handsome boys and political appointments doled out like love letters. Even after his death, the sanitizing began almost immediately. Letters disappeared, memoirs were edited, and his love for Villiers was rebranded as favor. Favor in this case being a strange euphemism for granting someone virtually unchecked power in both state and bedchamber. But here's the thing about royal secrets. They don't have to be hidden. They just have to be awkward enough that no one wants to talk about them. And if no one talks about them long enough, they become invisible. That's how you erase a truth without lying. You smother it in silence. Of course, James wasn't the only one cloaking private contradictions in public sanctimony. His grandson, Charles II, would take things a step further, playing the public Protestant by day and slipping toward Rome when no one was watching. Well, almost no one. 5. Charles II's hidden Catholicism. If his father died for the divine right of kings, Charles II lived for the divine right of plausible deniability. The Merry Monarch, they called him. England's Restoration King, freshly unexecuted after years of Republican unpleasantness. He returned to the throne in 1660 with a well-oiled charm, a wig for every occasion, and a stated devotion to the Church of England. Publicly, he was all hymns and hollow declarations. Privately, he was negotiating with the Pope. Charles II was a master of ambiguity. He had to be. His father, Charles I, had been executed not just for losing a war, but for being a little too cozy with Catholicism. England had spent over a century dancing nervously around the issue, with Protestants in charge and Catholics largely outlawed, suspected, and occasionally burned. Religion wasn't just personal belief, it was state identity. To be king in Protestant England and secretly Catholic was not just inconvenient, it was treasonous, against your own myth. So Charles did what clever monarchs do. He lied by omission. To the public, Charles played the part of the worldly, moderate Protestant king who just happened to tolerate Catholics because he was fair-minded. He took the Anglican sacrament, appeared at official services, and let Parliament believe he was reasonably devout, as long as it didn't get in the way of dinner or mistresses. But underneath the wigs and wine, he was doing something far more radical. He was making secret deals. In 1670, Charles signed the Treaty of Dover, a clandestine agreement with Catholic France. In exchange for French money and military support, Charles promised to convert to Catholicism at a time of his choosing, preferably when it wouldn't incite riots. The document was so secret that not even most of Charles's own ministers knew it existed. It was signed in invisible ink, metaphorically speaking. He'd promised his soul to Rome and his face to Canterbury. The timing was critical. England was broke. Parliament was suspicious. Religious tension was constant. Charles needed cash and couldn't get it from the Puritan-leaning Commons. France, however, had cash, and a desire to see Protestant England drift gently back toward papal influence. The perfect deal, except for the part where Charles had to pretend it wasn't happening. He delayed the conversion, and delayed, and delayed. Years passed, during which Charles continued to pretend. He maintained the facade, even as he pushed pro-Catholic policies and appointed Catholics to sensitive positions. His brother, James, openly Catholic, was groomed as heir, and the public grew restless. But Charles kept the peace, using charm and inertia like weapons. He had no interest in another civil war. He wanted to die in his bed, not on a scaffold. And in 1685, he did exactly that. But not before fulfilling the secret deal. On his deathbed, with breath nearly gone and privacy assured, Charles II converted. A Catholic priest was smuggled into the room. Last rites were whispered. No official statement was ever made. It was the final act in a lifetime of theatrical diplomacy. Charles had kept his promise to France, broken it to England, and ensured the truth wouldn't hit the newspapers until long after his body cooled. The cover-up continued after his death. Official histories minimized it. Some denied it entirely. For decades, schoolbooks politely referred to his faith as ambiguous. Church records didn't correct the assumption that he'd died a good Anglican. The monarchy needed Charles to be palatable. England needed its Restoration King to remain untroubled by inconvenient theology. But of course, secrets have a long shelf life in royal circles. And Charles's was inherited like an heirloom by his brother, James II, who didn't believe in subtlety or strategy. When James had a son, the rumors began immediately. And when that son was said to have arrived via a warming pan, the monarchy found itself in the middle of one of its strangest and most desperate cover-ups. 6. James II's warming pan baby, 1688. There are lies, and then there are lies so ridiculous they make it into history books simply because nobody could agree on how to kill them. The story of the warming pan baby is one of the latter. A royal cover-up so surreal, so absurd, it only made sense in the context of blind panic, deep-seated religious paranoia, and the kind of dynastic anxiety that keeps thrones trembling. In 1688, Queen Mary of Modena, wife of King James II, gave birth to a baby boy, James Francis Edward Stuart. This was supposed to be a triumph, an heir at last, a Catholic heir no less, born to a Catholic king, at a time when England's Protestant elite were already counting the days until James II shuffled off the throne and left no son behind to continue what they saw as Rome's quiet reconquest of Britain. Except, this child was very much born, in fact, too born, suspiciously so, which is when the story started to spread, that the child wasn't Mary's at all, but had been smuggled into the birthing chamber in a warming pan. The implication was cartoonish but potent, that the real royal baby had been stillborn, and a healthy Catholic impostor had been swapped in through a secret panel or sneaky midwife's sleight of hand, using a device more commonly associated with heating beds than launching dynastic crises. On the surface, the story was laughable, and yet it stuck. Not because it was believable, but because it was useful. Protestant nobles, already unsettled by James's open Catholicism and authoritarian leanings, now had a narrative they could rally around. The warming pan became a symbol, part joke, part political cudgel, and most importantly, it let them deny the legitimacy of the Catholic heir without having to admit they simply didn't want a Catholic dynasty. If the child wasn't really royal, then removing James was just restoring order. Not rebellion, not treason, just a cleaning service with wigs and swords. The monarchy, of course, scrambled to save face. Dozens of witnesses, midwives, nobles, servants, were summoned to testify that the birth had been real, the baby legitimate, and the queen in actual labor. But once a conspiracy theory takes root, especially one dressed in farce and dripping in politics, it's nearly impossible to dislodge. And this one had everything: religion, sex, royalty, betrayal, and kitchen utensils. The fallout was swift. Within months, James was forced to flee the country in what was dubbed the Glorious Revolution, a bloodless coup that replaced him with his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange. The baby prince, meanwhile, was smuggled out of England and raised in exile, his existence continuing to haunt the British monarchy like a ghost in the nursery. For decades, Jacobites, supporters of the ousted Stuart line, fought to restore James Francis Edward to the throne. To them, he was the rightful king. To the British government, he was the pretender. And to the average person, he was either a tragic prince or a baked baby conspiracy. But the most enduring aspect of the whole affair wasn't the political upheaval. It was the refusal to admit that fear, not evidence, had driven the narrative. The warming pan story was never proven, nor was it ever fully discredited. It lived in the national imagination because it offered a simple solution to a complicated truth. The country didn't want a Catholic monarch, so it invented a myth to erase him. And yet the warming pan baby wouldn't be the last royal trapped in a gilded cage of public deception. Another king would rise with secrets of his own, ones kept not in cradles or pans, but behind the locked doors of remote castles. A wife imprisoned. A nation told to forget. 7. George I's imprisoned wife. In the polite fiction of royal history, King George III was a respectable foreign import. German by birth, Protestant by design, and dutiful enough to sit on the English throne without ever bothering to learn proper English. He reigned from 1714 to 1727 as the first monarch of the House of Hanover, ushering in a new era of constitutional monarchy. He also brought with him a less discussed feature of continental royalty, a missing queen. Her name was Sophia Dorothea of Chile, and she was George's wife in the legal sense and his prisoner in every other. Their marriage, arranged when they were teenagers, was never one of love. It was transactional from the start. George needed money and heirs, and Sophia, the illegitimate but legitimized daughter of a German duke, offered both. They had 2 children, one of whom would become George II, but the relationship collapsed almost immediately. The problem wasn't just that George was cold, controlling, and prone to long absences. It was also that he brought a mistress with him to the marriage and made no effort to hide the arrangement. In fact, he eventually brought 2. Sophia Dorothea, however, did something no good royal wife was supposed to do. She pushed back. She wanted to leave. Worse, she wanted to leave for another man. Her alleged lover was Count Philip Christoph von Königsmarck, a Swedish count with whom she exchanged letters, many of which read more like desperate diary entries than scandalous seductions. Whatever the true nature of their relationship, it was enough to terrify George and his court. Because if Sophia left, and left publicly, it would cause a royal embarrassment, threaten the legitimacy of their children, and undermine the delicate alliances George depended on. So the story took a darker turn. Königsmarck disappeared. Vanished, actually. One night he walked into the Schloss, the ducal palace in Hanover, and was never seen again. Rumors quickly spread that he had been murdered, possibly hacked to pieces and buried beneath the floorboards. The palace denied everything, of course. No body was found. No charges were brought. Just a quietly erased man. As for Sophia Dorothea, she was arrested, forcibly separated from her children, and imprisoned in Castle Alden, a remote, damp estate where she would remain for the next 30 years. Not a year, not 5, 30. She was declared legally dead by George's court and erased from all official documentation. Portraits were destroyed or tucked away. Her name was removed from family trees. It was as if she had never existed. And why? Because the scandal was inconvenient, divorce was politically dangerous, and a public trial would mean testimony, witnesses, exposure. Far easier to disappear her, to redefine loyalty as silence. So the English court, always happy to avoid an international scene, never acknowledged Sophia's imprisonment. Even after George became King of England, he never brought her with him, never spoke her name in public, never permitted contact between her and their children. She died in captivity in 1726. No state funeral, no royal acknowledgement. The woman who had once been destined to be Queen of England was buried quietly, far from the court that had turned its back on her. George III outlived her by just a year, dying on one of his many trips back to Hanover. His reign was remembered as stable, moderate, and deeply uncharismatic. The scandal of his missing wife, buried right alongside him in the official record. But the cover-up didn't die. It evolved. Because the idea of a monarch losing control, of a royal woman choosing love over duty, was too dangerous to acknowledge, especially when the next king, George III, would become a living symbol of control lost entirely. Not to scandal, but to something the royal court feared even more than infidelity: madness. 8. George III's madness, late 1700s. For a monarch obsessed with order, the irony was cruel. George III, the king who reigned through revolutions, resisted reform, and demanded propriety from the chaos of his court, spent the last decades of his life unraveling in the most disorderly way imaginable. But the nation didn't see it. Or rather, it saw something, just not the whole truth. Because what happened behind palace walls was carefully managed, delicately phrased, and sometimes deliberately erased. The king was indisposed. He was melancholy. He was not quite himself. All phrases that sound innocent, even sympathetic, until you realize they were code for a terrifying decline that shook the monarchy to its core. The first major episode came in 1788. Seemingly out of nowhere, the king began talking incessantly, often without meaning, and for hours on end. He became erratic, shouting at courtiers, writing long, rambling letters, and occasionally foaming at the mouth. Parliament panicked. Courtiers whispered. The country braced for instability. A regency bill was drafted, ready to hand power to his son, the Prince of Wales, who was, in every sense, ill-prepared and overly enthusiastic about that prospect. And then, George recovered. Miraculously, almost conveniently. He reappeared in public with rehearsed poise and cheerful declarations, his physicians assuring everyone that His Majesty had simply suffered a nervous affliction. A temporary cloud, they said. The sunlight had returned. But it hadn't. Not really. What followed were decades of instability carefully contained. George had recurring episodes, each more intense than the last. The court scrambled to shield him from view whenever his behavior crossed the threshold from eccentric to alarming. Doctors were summoned at all hours. Records were rewritten. Staff were rotated, silenced, or paid off. His correspondence, once regular and coherent, grew sparse and erratic. The public saw less and less of their king. But instead of alarm, they were fed a diet of reassurances. The king was tired. The king was resting. The king was devoutly reading scripture in Windsor. The truth, what little leaked, was unsettling. George would talk to trees as if they were courtiers. He confused days, months, and years. He barked orders to people who weren't there. He laughed, then wept, then screamed. He once tried to shake hands with an empty chair, believing it to be the French ambassador. His physicians, many of whom kept detailed notes, were pressured to soften the facts before they reached anyone who mattered. Even his family wasn't exempt from the cover-up. His son, the Prince Regent, capitalized on the king's illness to consolidate power, but stopped short of revealing too much. Why? Because revealing too much would weaken the monarchy itself. If the king was mad, the institution that depended on his divine right would look equally fragile. And fragile things tend to break. It wasn't until the final years of his life, blind, deaf, and completely removed from public life, that the truth became undeniable. By then, George III had become a ghost haunting Windsor Castle, a forgotten sovereign in his own reign. Parliament ruled in his name, but without his presence. His image was maintained in coins, portraits, and carefully staged appearances, while the real man sat in solitude, mumbling to no one in particular. And even then, the official language was cautious. Euphemisms endured. Textbooks told children he had been unwell. Memorials focused on his piety, his agricultural hobbies, and his stubbornness during the American Revolution. They didn't talk about the screaming fits, the hallucinations, or the decades of silence behind palace doors. It took centuries for historians to even agree that George III likely suffered from a chronic mental illness, possibly porphyria, or more recently theorized as bipolar disorder. But the diagnosis matters less than the cover-up that surrounded it. Because in royal history, it's not the illness that damages the crown. It's the acknowledgement of weakness. And weakness had to be hidden, rewritten, buried. Just as another chapter would be buried not long after George's reign ended, a chapter involving a secret marriage, a Catholic wife, and the kind of royal love story that only existed if no one ever talked about it. 9. The secret marriage of George IV to Maria Fitzherbert. Long before he officially became King George IV, the Prince of Wales fell in love, recklessly, sincerely, and very, very inconveniently. Her name was Maria Fitzherbert, a twice-widowed Catholic woman of good family, sharp wit, and zero political usefulness. She was everything the British crown didn't want in a royal consort, which made her irresistible naturally. George, flamboyant and debt-ridden even in his 20s, met Maria in 1784. According to every surviving account, he was immediately and hopelessly obsessed. She, on the other hand, was less convinced. And she had reason to be. As a Catholic, she knew marrying the heir to the throne was not just forbidden, it was illegal under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772 and the Act of Settlement. Any union between a British royal and a Catholic was invalid by law. In short, if she married him, she would gain nothing, risk everything, and possibly spark a constitutional crisis. But love, or at least something that passed for it, triumphed over caution. After months of intense pursuit, and at least one theatrical suicide threat on George's part, Maria finally relented. On December 15, 1785, they were married in a clandestine ceremony conducted by a disgraced Anglican clergyman with only a few witnesses present. The marriage had no legal standing under British law, and both of them knew it. But to George, and possibly to Maria, it was real. This would have been a private scandal, if not for the fact that George, in true royal fashion, couldn't keep quiet about it. He began referring to Maria as his wife in private conversations. Letters circulated. The prince had a habit of declaring his love in writing, and unfortunately for him, paper tends to outlive passion. The relationship endured for years, waxing and waning alongside his mood swings and mounting debts. Maria was occasionally seen at court, always unofficially, always carefully handled. Her presence was both an open secret and a state embarrassment. When George needed to marry officially, meaning legally, and preferably to someone not banned by the Constitution, he reluctantly agreed to wed Caroline of Brunswick in 1795. It was a diplomatic match, and a catastrophic personal one. George was reportedly drunk at the wedding and claimed he could barely stand the sight of his new bride. Unsurprisingly, the marriage collapsed almost immediately, and he returned, at least emotionally, to Maria. The royal establishment, meanwhile, did everything it could to erase the Fitzherbert affair from the official narrative. The marriage certificate was locked away. The clergyman disappeared from polite society. Any mention of the union was quietly but firmly denied. Maria, for her part, never publicly asserted her status, though she kept portraits of George and wore a miniature ring bearing his hair. She lived out her life in a kind of dignified limbo, respected by some, avoided by others, acknowledged by no one with real power. After George's death in 1830, she received a generous pension and a carefully worded letter from his brother, now King William IV, recognizing her long and faithful attachment to the late king. No mention of marriage, no title, no legal admission, just a nod across the divide of royal protocol. The official narrative maintained that George's only lawful wife was Caroline of Brunswick. The irony, of course, is that he hated Caroline, publicly separated from her, and barred her from his coronation. But she was Protestant, and legal, and that, in royal arithmetic, always outweighed affection. To this day, the British monarchy has never formally acknowledged George IV's secret marriage. The cover-up isn't a dramatic affair of falsified records or altered portraits. It's something quieter, omission, denial by silence, history rewritten by what it refuses to print. But the habit of hiding inconvenient women wouldn't end with Maria Fitzherbert. A few decades later, a queen would strike up a scandalously close relationship with a Scottish servant, and the royal family would once again reach for the eraser. This time, the offense wasn't marriage, it was intimacy across class lines. And that, it turned out, was just as threatening. 10. Queen Victoria's relationship with John Brown. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Queen Victoria didn't just lose a husband, she lost her access. The mourning was immediate, intense, and deeply public. Black dresses, black veils, black carriage horses. For years. The monarch who had once been a symbol of British strength became a ghost inside her own empire. She withdrew from public duties, avoided court appearances, and surrounded herself with memories of Albert, portraits, busts, his clothes laid out exactly as he'd left them. Britain was told she was grieving, and for a while it believed her. But grief, like royalty, is rarely simple. And into that vacuum of silence stepped a man named John Brown, a Scottish servant, a former gillie, something between a personal valet and a wilderness guide, who had served Prince Albert and, in Albert's absence, quietly began serving the Queen. First in small ways, then in every way. He was brusque, loyal, and inconveniently present. Too present. Brown wasn't polished. He wasn't deferential. He spoke to Victoria as no one else dared to. He addressed her as woman instead of Your Majesty on at least one occasion, a fact which somehow did not result in his immediate dismissal. On the contrary, he gained power, access. She made him her personal attendant, gave him rooms near hers, let him decide who could and couldn't approach her. And more than that, she let him in emotionally. No one else could. No one else dared. Soon, rumors ignited that they were lovers, that they were secretly married, that she'd had his child, that Brown ran the palace, that he drank too much, that he called the Queen pet names in public. Parliament was horrified. The press was merciless. Courtiers fumed. But Victoria? She simply didn't care. Or more precisely, she acted like she didn't. She shielded Brown, rewarded him, allowed his influence to grow unchecked. The monarchy, however, couldn't afford such eccentric transparency. As the rumors spread, so did the damage control. Letters between them were quietly destroyed. Portraits and busts of Brown were removed from display. Official histories described him as loyal, but overfamiliar. The royal household walked a tightrope between embarrassment and denial. After all, admitting that a queen might have emotionally depended on a working-class servant, let alone loved him, was more threatening to the social fabric than any affair between nobles. This wasn't just about romance. It was about class, control, and the sacred narrative of monarchy as untouchable. When Brown died suddenly in 1883, Victoria was devastated. She wore mourning for him, kept a lock of his hair in a locket, and commissioned a statue in his memory, one that had to be moved after her death due to public discomfort. She had a large portrait of him hung at Osborne House, and perhaps most controversially, she had a personal memorial placed near her tomb, where it was later revealed a lock of his hair and his photograph were buried with her. After her death, Edward VII took immediate action. All references to Brown were removed from the royal residences. Letters were seized. The statue was moved out of public sight. The memorial was discreetly repositioned. Brown's name was not forbidden exactly, but it was heavily discouraged. The official story receded to a faint outline. A loyal servant, honored for his faithfulness. Nothing more. But history doesn't quite forget. And the very ferocity of the cover-up only deepened the public's suspicion. For decades, the phrase Queen Victoria's John Brown became shorthand for relationships that shall not be named. Later still, a second servant would enter Victoria's life, Abdul Karim, an Indian Muslim who faced similar suspicion, disdain, and attempted erasure. But Brown came first. And while his existence couldn't be scrubbed from the record entirely, the royal machine tried its best to reduce him from a man to a footnote. Still, Brown's presence lingers. In whispers, in rumors, in the gaps between what we're told and what we know. And those gaps are where monarchy's myths are most carefully maintained. But Victoria's descendant, her son Edward VII, would bring with him no interest in myth-making. His scandals wouldn't need to be whispered. They'd just be cleaned up by an obedient press and forgotten by polite society. And that silence, as ever, was by design. 11. Edward VII's affair. Fueled lifestyle. Before he was king, Edward VII was a problem. Not a scandal, not a misstep, a problem. For his mother, Queen Victoria, the problem was moral. Edward, or Bertie, as his family called him, seemed physically incapable of behaving like a future monarch. For the establishment, the problem was political. He was reckless, undisciplined, and treated the monarchy not as a sacred duty, but as an inherited inconvenience. And for the palace, the problem was logistical, because no matter how outrageous his behavior became, it had to be hidden, or at the very least, handled. Edward was born into a world that demanded royal virtue and Victorian restraint. He responded with mistresses, gambling, drinking, and a relentless enthusiasm for expensive pleasures. His mother hoped to mold him into a second Prince Albert, intellectual, pious, disciplined. Instead, she got an overgrown teenager with a taste for French actresses and champagne breakfasts. From his 20s onward, Edward's love life was both a private obsession and a public liability. His most well-known mistress, the actress Lily Langtry, was just the tip of a sprawling iceberg. There were dozens of women, aristocrats, performers, society wives, all of whom played their part in the unofficial royal harem. He entertained them in country houses, private apartments, even a custom-built love chair, reportedly housed in a Parisian brothel. But what mattered most wasn't the indulgence. It was the cover-up. Because while Edward's behavior was no secret among the upper classes, it was almost entirely hidden from the public. The British press, deeply deferential at the time, made a silent pact with the monarchy. The prince's extracurriculars would remain unreported as long as he stayed marginally discreet. This arrangement was upheld through subtle intimidation, bribery, and the ever-useful threat of revoked access. Editors complied, stories were killed, photographs destroyed, witnesses paid off. The aristocracy knew, but the newspapers didn't tell. And as long as the public remained unaware, the crown remained untarnished. Behind closed doors, palace staff ran a constant damage control operation. There were discreet settlements with women whose relationships with the prince had become complicated. Nobles were advised to keep their daughters away from Sandringham. And whenever rumors leaked too far, they were dismissed as continental gossip, unfit for respectable English ears. If scandal couldn't be denied, it was mocked, framed as harmless indulgence, the quaint excesses of a charming rogue, a future king who, like his French cousins, simply loved too well and too often. But underneath the cigars and satin sheets was a fragile institution stretched thin by denial. Victoria's long reign had demanded moral purity. Edward's life made a mockery of it. And when he finally ascended the throne at the age of 59, he brought with him a royal image completely divorced from reality. He was crowned as a statesman and a peacemaker, a monarch of dignity and diplomacy. Official portraits showed a stern, responsible ruler. There were no references to the actresses, no mention of the champagne bills, no trace of the affairs that had defined his adult life. Even after his death, the record was carefully pruned. Memoirs were edited, letters disappeared. Former lovers either remained silent or were encouraged to do so through polite legal threats. The monarchy presented Edward VII as the steadying figure who helped modernize the crown. The truth, that he was perhaps the most openly indulgent royal of his generation, was simply absorbed into the polite machinery of history. But not everything could be papered over. His son, the Duke of Clarence, would carry with him not just the genetic legacy of the crown, but the haunting whispers of a far darker rumor. Because some cover-ups protect reputations. Others bury something more dangerous, like involvement in a male brothel, or worse, an alleged connection to one of the most notorious killers in British history. 12. The 1910s. Duke of Clarence scandal. Prince Albert Victor. There are royal scandals, and then there are royal sinkholes, massive, swallowing, and too deep to properly fence off. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, fits neatly into the latter category. Born in 1864 as the eldest son of Edward VII and second in line to the throne, Albert Victor was the great royal hope, handsome, aristocratic, groomed for the crown. But what he left behind wasn't a legacy, it was a vacuum, a mystery so laced with rumor, redactions, and contradictory records that even seasoned historians aren't sure what's real and what was deliberately wiped. To the public, Albert Victor, or Eddie, as the family called him, was a charming, if somewhat vacant figure. He attended Cambridge, he served briefly in the army, he was made Duke of Clarence, and he died young, at just 28, supposedly of pneumonia. A tragic figure, a royal gone too soon. End of story. Unless you start peeling back the polite version. Behind the soft-focus portraits and state-approved eulogies was a man who hovered near multiple scandals that the royal family worked very hard to forget. The most persistent of these is his alleged involvement in the Cleveland Street scandal of 1889, a case involving a male brothel in London, frequented by men of high society and staffed by teenage telegraph boys. When the establishment was caught in the headlights, the Home Office scrambled to contain the fallout. Names were removed from reports, witnesses were coached, trials were tightly controlled. And somewhere, circling the edges of the story, was the Duke of Clarence. Though his name never appeared in the official documents, rumors took off with ferocity. Police files hinted that a member of the royal family might have been involved. Whispers among the aristocracy suggested Eddie had either visited the brothel himself or was dangerously close to someone who had. Conservative newspapers went silent. Liberal papers published carefully vague accusations. The Crown responded with its favorite tool, strategic vagueness. No comment, no confirmation, no denial. Just the rustling of curtains and the sudden reassigning of anyone who knew too much. Then came the darker, more bizarre speculation. As the public began devouring reports of the Jack the Ripper murders in 1888, conspiracy theories bloomed like Victorian fog. Some claimed that Prince Albert Victor was the Ripper, unstable, secretive, moved through the right social circles. Others claimed he had impregnated a working-class woman and that the murders were part of a cover-up. The theories were outlandish, yes, but the royal family's refusal to confront them only added fuel. Officially, Albert Victor had an airtight alibi for each of the Ripper murders. He was attending dinners, traveling, or otherwise accounted for. But records were suspiciously incomplete. Diaries were lost, letters disappeared, and the Crown's unwillingness to release key documents kept the mystery breathing. When Eddie died in 1892, just months after getting engaged to Princess Mary of Teck, who would eventually marry his younger brother, the future George V, the narrative was rewritten instantly. He became the doomed prince, the royal tragedy. A man who, had he lived, might have changed everything. But the subtext lingered. Why was so much destroyed after his death? Why were files sealed indefinitely? Why did certain officials involved in the Cleveland Street case quietly disappear from public service? The British state has always excelled at covering embarrassment with velvet, never lying outright, just denying oxygen to the inconvenient. Albert Victor became a case study in historical ambiguity. He may have been innocent of all accusations. He may have been guilty of some. But the truth was rendered irrelevant the moment the palace decided that no truth at all was safer than a complicated one. And the precedent was set. When a royal's public image is too fragile for the facts must be sacrificed. A strategy that would be deployed with chilling consistency a generation later, when another prince, Edward VIII, chose not just the wrong woman, but the wrong side of history. 13. Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson's Nazi connections. When Edward VIII abdicated the throne in 1936 for the woman I love, it was hailed as a romantic tragedy, a fairy tale gone sideways. A king who gave up an empire to marry Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American socialite with a sharp tongue, a taste for luxury, and a knack for upsetting everyone in the room. The British public was told this was a matter of personal conscience, a collision between love and duty. What they weren't told, what they weren't allowed to know for decades, was that Edward's departure from the throne wasn't just about Wallace. It was also about Hitler. Yes, that Hitler. It's difficult to overstate how delicately the British establishment has handled Edward VIII's flirtation with fascism. Because the deeper you dig, the harder it becomes to dismiss it as youthful ignorance or unfortunate timing. This wasn't a case of a well-meaning aristocrat being duped by propaganda. This was a man who admired authoritarian strength, resented democracy, and saw in Hitler a kind of ideological kinship. During his brief reign, Edward had already shown troubling sympathies. He expressed admiration for Mussolini. He made no secret of his disdain for liberal politicians, and he frequently made statements that alarmed his own government, suggesting Britain should negotiate with Germany, or that the Nazis were misunderstood. Churchill and other senior figures saw the danger. But what do you do with a sitting king who sympathizes with your enemy? You wait, you hope, and when he abdicates, you bury everything that could suggest he was more than just inconvenient. After the abdication, Edward was given the title Duke of Windsor and effectively exiled. He and Wallace toured Europe, settled in France, and socialized freely with the Nazi elite. In 1937, just 1 year before the outbreak of World War II, they visited Germany. The photos from that trip are astonishing. Edward and Wallace smiling at Nazi officials. Edward giving what appears to be a version of the Nazi salute. Edward meeting privately with Hitler and Berghof. That meeting for years was dismissed as a diplomatic courtesy. What it actually involved has been the subject of speculation ever since. British intelligence watched nervously as the Duke made himself too available to Nazi interests. Wallace was rumored to have had close relationships with high-ranking German officers. There were whispers of espionage, of pillow talk turned into state secrets. The Nazis, sensing opportunity, considered using Edward as a puppet king if they successfully invaded Britain. A plan, Operation Willie, was developed to kidnap or entice the Duke back to Germany and install him as a compliant monarch under a Nazi regime. Churchill, to his credit, acted decisively. He ordered the Windsors shipped off to the Bahamas, under the pretense of a colonial governorship, but in truth, a form of elegant exile. Edward sulked. Wallace complained, but the message was clear. Stay quiet, stay far away, and don't come back until the war is over, and preferably not even then. After the war, the files didn't surface. They were locked, suppressed, sanitized. For decades, the official biography of Edward VIII focused on his romance, his tragic love story, and his life in exile. The Nazi sympathies were treated as rumors, fringe theories, unfortunate misunderstandings. It wasn't until the 1950s and 60s that some of the original documents, letters, diplomatic cables, intelligence memos, began to emerge. The 1990s brought more, and still to this day, many remain sealed or redacted. The official line remains cautiously neutral. The Duke was misguided. He was naive. He didn't understand the full nature of the regime he was dealing with, perhaps. But naivety doesn't explain warm meetings, friendly letters, or his ongoing complaints that Germany was being treated unfairly after the war crimes came to light. And here lies the true cover-up. Not just the facts, but the framing. Turning Edward into a lovesick exile was a brilliant piece of royal damage control. It reframed a potential traitor as a tragic romantic, a man who gave up everything for love, rather than a man who was gently removed before he could do something far worse. Still, family secrets have a way of repeating themselves. Edward wasn't the only brother to be quietly erased. One of George VI's siblings would be hidden so completely from public view that many assumed he had died in childhood. In a way, he had, but not in the way the public was told. 14. George VI's brother John's epilepsy. In the grand family portrait of the British royals, there is always someone missing, someone blurred, cropped, or quietly erased before the final print. For the House of Windsor, that person was Prince John, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary, and the younger brother of two future kings, Edward VIII and George VI. By birth, he was every bit a prince of the realm. By reality, he was a secret. Prince John was born in 1905 into a family that was already beginning to modernize its image. But modernity had limits, and so did the monarchy's tolerance for imperfection. From an early age, John was described as different. He was lively, bright-eyed, full of energy, but he also struggled with attention, displayed signs of developmental delays, and by age 4 began having seizures. Today, his condition would likely be diagnosed as epilepsy, perhaps accompanied by what some experts suspect may have been autism or a learning disability. Back then, such things were whispered about, not discussed, and certainly not associated with royalty. At first, there were attempts to include him in royal life. Early photographs show a cheerful young boy among his siblings attending family events, dressed in sailor suits, just like his brothers. But as his condition worsened, his seizures becoming more frequent and harder to manage, he began to disappear from public life. Official court bulletins rarely mentioned him. Family outings stopped including him. And by 1916, at the age of 11, Prince John was sent away from the palace. He was moved to Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, a modest country house surrounded by woods and staff. The official explanation was for his health, the fresh air, the quiet, the freedom from court pressures. But the truth is harder to romanticize. He was hidden. A royal child too unpredictable, too difficult, too publicly inconvenient to be allowed near the image the family was carefully cultivating. He was given 2 caretakers, a private nurse, and the companionship of the estate's animals. His siblings rarely visited, his parents even less. No school, no official duties, no titles, just silence. When he died in 1919 at the age of 13 from a massive seizure, the royal family issued a brief and sterile statement. The funeral was small and private. Newspapers printed his name beneath headlines about weather and sport. There were no national mourning periods, no retrospectives, no elaborate processions. The public, for the most part, barely knew he existed. And that, it seems, was the point. Only years later did the truth begin to resurface. Letters from Queen Mary describe her grief, but also her relief. She wrote of his suffering, but also how his death had spared the family from further difficulty. Historians looking back at the case often note that Prince John's exile wasn't driven purely by cruelty. It was driven by fear of scandal, fear of weakness, fear that a monarch's power might look compromised by something as uncontrollable as illness. For a family obsessed with image, Prince John was the worst-case scenario, a royal child who couldn't be groomed, presented, or explained. It took nearly a century for his story to be more openly acknowledged. Documentaries, biographies, and even dramatizations began to explore the tragedy of his isolation. But the institutional silence surrounding him, the decision to erase rather than confront, remains one of the clearest examples of how the British royal family managed imperfection, not by compassion, but by exile. And the strategy wasn't limited to children. Another royal brother, this one grown, charismatic, and popular, would find his own indiscretions hidden behind the same curtain of quiet erasure. But unlike Prince John, this brother's secrets weren't about health. They were about desire, women, and the dangerous possibility of illegitimate heirs. 15. George VI's brother Edward's mistresses and illegitimate children. The British royal family doesn't deal in scandal. It deals in shadows. Affairs don't happen. They're friendships. Children don't appear. They're rumored. And if a prince behaves badly, the real consequence isn't accountability. It's strategic forgetting. Enter Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, the younger brother of George VI, uncle to Queen Elizabeth II, and a man whose legacy is made of half-buried stories and footnotes edited with surgical precision. Not to be confused with his nephew of the same title, this Prince Edward was born in 1902, raised with military discipline and dynastic expectations, and wrapped in the polite constraints of royal protocol. He was charming, cosmopolitan, and, to the discomfort of his handlers, almost entirely uninterested in discretion. Women adored him. He adored them right back. Married or not, titled or not, it didn't seem to matter. By the 1920s and 30s, Edward had cultivated a reputation as the most glamorous and unpredictable royal of his generation. He moved in bohemian circles. He socialized with artists, writers, and actresses. He spoke multiple languages, traveled frequently, and always seemed to be involved with someone he shouldn't be. The palace called it flamboyant. Everyone else called it what it was: a pattern. Among the names that cropped up in Edward's orbit were international beauties, high society hostesses, and several women of artistic fame. There was a consistent theme. They were charismatic, unavailable, and willing to keep secrets. Some relationships were long-term, others fleeting, but the implication was always the same. This was a prince with a private life far more complicated than the official portrait suggested. And then came the rumors of children. Not heirs, not acknowledged, not in line for anything but whispers. Several names appear in the unofficial files of royal historians, women who claim to have had children with the Duke of Kent, or whose families made quiet financial arrangements with palace intermediaries. One story in particular centers on a well-known socialite who, in the late 1930s, gave birth to a child widely believed to be Edward's. The royal family never commented. The child was never acknowledged. But the woman received a mysterious trust fund, and her child was enrolled in one of the better British boarding schools without any visible source of income. Coincidence? Perhaps, but there were too many coincidences, and too much silence. What makes this cover-up so effective is its structure. Nothing is denied. Nothing is confirmed. The archive files related to Edward remain partially sealed. Letters are missing. Key personal correspondences from his adult life were destroyed, some by Edward himself, others by palace aides in the days following his death. It's not what was said. It's what wasn't allowed to survive long enough to be asked about. The royal family's strategy with Edward wasn't to rewrite the record. It was to drain it of oxygen. His public image remained clean, formal, and military. A dedicated officer, a family man, a war hero. The unofficial version was quietly nudged into irrelevance. Even his death in 1942, a plane crash during active service in World War II, was smoothed over with vagueness. The official story involved bad weather, pilot error, a tragic accident. But the details were muddled, and the investigation quietly inconclusive. Some whispered about sabotage. Others claimed he shouldn't have been on the flight at all. Regardless, his death was convenient. He was buried with honors. The press eulogized a noble royal lost too soon. And with him, any lingering questions about mistresses, children, or secrets went into the grave as well. But erasure only works if no one else notices. And Edward wasn't the only royal with relatives carrying controversial associations. Across the channel, and across the dinner table, the Queen Mother's own brothers had friends in suspicious places, namely Berlin. And no one in the royal family wanted the public to find out just how friendly those relationships had once been. 16. Queen Mother's brothers as Nazi sympathizers. The Queen Mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, was often portrayed as the embodiment of stoic British grace. wartime heroine, the smiling matriarch, a national treasure draped in pearls and pastel hats. But behind the lacquered image of royal dignity, her family history held a distinctly unrosy undertone. Specifically, her brothers, Fergus and David Bowes-Lyon. Names that, outside of aristocratic directories and scattered war memorials, rarely surface. And when they do, it's usually in carefully filtered terms, which is no accident. The uncomfortable truth, murmured in diplomatic back channels and buried in classified correspondence for decades, is this. Certain members of the Bowes-Lyon family, particularly David, were deeply entangled with British circles that advocated appeasement, admired fascist order, and held quiet, at times open sympathies for Nazi Germany. David Bowes-Lyon, the Queen Mother's surviving brother, was a well-connected aristocrat with political ambitions. He served as Lord Lieutenant of Hertfordshire and later worked in diplomatic roles. But during the 1930s, before the full horror of Hitler's regime had reached British newspapers, David and others in his social sphere were linked to what might generously be called pro-German sentiment, and less generously, collaborationist ideology. This wasn't rare among the upper classes of Britain at the time. Many in the aristocracy saw fascism not as a threat, but as a safeguard. It promised order in a chaotic world. It crushed communism. It kept the labor class in line. And crucially, it preserved hereditary privilege. To them, fascism was less a dictatorship and more a rebrand of the old world they already believed in, just with sharper uniforms and slightly more saluting. David Bowes-Lyon reportedly attended events and private meetings where admiration for Nazi Germany was not only expressed but encouraged. Some of his close associates were later revealed to be part of pro-Hitler networks in Britain, groups that lobbied for peace with Germany even as war loomed. It's not that David himself stood on a podium shouting fascist slogans. It's that he didn't need to. His presence, his silence, and his association with figures like Sir Oswald Mosley and members of the Anglo-German Fellowship did the talking for him. After World War II, when the full extent of Nazi atrocities came to light, these associations became toxic, and the palace moved quickly. David's wartime service, he worked with British intelligence in France, was emphasized. His pre-war friendships were quietly redacted. Archival material related to the Bowes-Lyon family's political sympathies before 1939 became difficult to access, and requests were often denied under vague claims of national interest. The Queen Mother, meanwhile, maintained her image as the rock of the monarchy. No one asked her on record about her brother's affiliations. No journalist pushed the issue. And when David died in 1961, obituaries remembered him as a gentleman of public service. Not a single national outlet mentioned his links to pro-German networks or his proximity to appeasement circles. This isn't to say David was a traitor, but in the world of royal scandal, complicity is rarely loud. It's quiet. It's sipping champagne with the wrong people at the wrong garden party. It's knowing and not caring, or caring and doing nothing. And while David Bowes-Lyon faded into the background of history, his sister rose higher, becoming the Queen Mother, the smiling face of post-war Britain. The connection between them was preserved in blood, but severed in narrative. Still, the palace's skill at managing such historical footnotes was only just hitting its stride. Because not long after, another woman, Wallis Simpson, would require similar erasure. But this time, it wouldn't be for what she did. It would be for what they didn't want you to know about what she was before she ever met a king. 17. The suppression of Wallis Simpson's divorce details. Wallis Simpson didn't just threaten the British monarchy with her presence. She threatened it with her past. When Edward VIII fell in love with her, the crisis wasn't just about who she was, a twice-divorced American socialite with no title and a trail of scandalized husbands. It was about what she represented: modernity, independence, and most inconveniently, a paper trail. By the time Edward met her, Wallis had already been through one divorce and was working on her second. Her marriage to Ernest Simpson, a shipping executive, was still legally intact. But that didn't stop the future king from falling hard and fast. To the royal family, this wasn't just a social embarrassment. It was a constitutional landmine. A monarch, as supreme governor of the Church of England, could not marry a divorcee with living ex-spouses. It wasn't merely frowned upon, it was, in practice, a breach of his spiritual authority. So when Edward insisted on marrying Wallis, the system panicked. Newspapers, particularly in Britain, were ordered not to report on the relationship. The British public remained largely unaware of the brewing crisis for months, while the foreign press ran wild with the story. But that was just the beginning. As the relationship intensified, palace operatives scrambled to manage not just the current scandal, but the past one: Wallis's divorce history. It wasn't just about morality. Wallis's previous marriage had ended under suspicious circumstances. While the official narrative claimed incompatibility and growing apart behind closed doors, there were rumors of infidelity, volatile behavior, and discreet settlements. Her first marriage to Earl Winfield Spencer, a U.S. Navy pilot, had been marred by accusations of drinking and emotional cruelty, though the details were kept vague, and the divorce finalized with minimal public attention. But the real threat lay in the second divorce, the one that would legally enable her to marry Edward. The Simpson divorce proceedings, filed in 1936, were quietly expedited in the UK courts, using the flimsiest of pretexts. Ernest Simpson agreed to admit to adultery in a staged arrangement that would legally allow Wallis to be the injured party. In reality, Ernest was still financially supporting her, and the other woman used in court was reportedly part of a legal performance everyone agreed to maintain. The arrangement was tidy, artificial, and incredibly fragile. If the truth of this collusion had emerged publicly, that Wallis's divorce was effectively engineered through legal trickery, it could have made her marriage to Edward not only scandalous but potentially invalid. Worse, it could have exposed the monarchy's direct role in manipulating British law to serve personal interests. That was a narrative no one at court wanted to entertain. So, the cover-up began. Court records were sealed. Journalists were warned, some more forcefully than others. Documents that contradicted the official story were quietly lost. Even after the abdication crisis exploded, when Edward gave up the throne in December 1936, the media coverage was carefully stage-managed. The public was told it was a love story, that the king had sacrificed everything for a woman he couldn't live without. What they weren't told was that every step had been orchestrated, her divorce sanitized, her past edited, her most complicated details repackaged as royal romance. Wallis herself became complicit in the myth. She denied certain relationships, rewrote timelines in her memoirs, and posed in photo shoots that turned her into an icon of misunderstood glamour. The reality of her tangled marital past was lost beneath hats, pearls, and soft focus lighting. And yet, beneath all that polish, the threat remained. Not because of who Wallis was, but because of what she proved, that a well-timed love affair, backed by documents and silence, could destabilize the oldest monarchy in Europe. But if Wallis was the woman who brought a king to his knees, another royal, Edward's younger brother George, would meet a far more literal fall. A prince with secrets, a wartime plane crash, and a posthumous biography riddled with question marks. 18. The Duke of Kent's Affairs and Death, 1942. Prince George, Duke of Kent, lived a life stitched together from contradictions. Royal officer and underground socialite, family man and figure of whispered scandal, war hero and cautionary tale. He was the younger brother of King George VI, the uncle of Queen Elizabeth II, and one of the most enigmatic figures in 20th century royal history. And yet, for someone so close to the throne, his story remains unusually thin, scrubbed, trimmed, and dusted with a veil of official politeness, especially when it comes to how he lived and how he died. Born in 1902, Prince George was everything a royal should be: handsome, educated, multilingual, and visibly engaged in public life. He was also, by all accounts, deeply restless. After brief stints in the Navy and Foreign Office, he settled into a hybrid existence of ceremonial duties and private diversions. And it's that second category, the private, where the cover-up begins. George had a long-standing reputation for romantic affairs, and not just the garden variety, upper-crust flirtations typical of royalty. His relationships reportedly crossed gender lines, class lines, and occasionally, the borders of acceptability for a member of the royal family. Several sources, biographers, former staff, and unnamed insiders, have claimed the Duke had affairs with both men and women, including high-profile figures in the entertainment world. Names like Noel Coward and Barbara Cartland have been floated, though never officially confirmed. The palace has always refused to comment, which, in royal terms, is not denial, it's containment. What's known with certainty is that George was closely connected to individuals within Britain's pre-war high society who later became known for their sympathies with fascism and Nazi Germany. He was part of the same elite circles that produced figures like Oswald Mosley. The full extent of his political leanings remains murky, deliberately so. But suspicions have never been fully laid to rest. MI5 files from the period are still sealed. Portions of his personal correspondence remain missing. The air around Prince George is full of empty folders. Then came his death. On August 25, 1942, Prince George boarded a Sunderland flying boat en route to Iceland as part of his RAF duties. The plane crashed in the Scottish Highlands, killing 14 of the 15 people on board. The sole survivor, Flight Sergeant Andrew Jack, gave an account that raised more questions than answers. Officially, the crash was blamed on pilot error and poor visibility. Unofficially, speculation has flourished for decades. Why was the prince on a military flight with personnel whose presence was never explained? Why were parts of the crash investigation sealed? Why did several reports disappear or get heavily redacted before being archived? One theory suggests that George had been carrying sensitive documents. Another claims he was on a covert mission. A third, and more dramatic, suggests he was flying to negotiate some form of back-channel peace with Germany, unauthorized and unsanctioned. Conspiracy theories aside, the facts are elusive by design. The royal family treated his death as a tragic accident and quickly shifted focus to memorializing him. A funeral was held, his service was praised, and a generation was told that he died in the line of duty. What wasn't told was that many in the government breathed a quiet sigh of relief. A royal with too many connections, too many secrets, and too little discipline had exited the stage. Years later, when researchers attempted to access documents related to the crash, they were told that many were lost or unavailable. The result? An enduring question mark in royal history, not because the truth is unknowable, but because it's been deliberately obscured. And Prince George wasn't the only relative quietly cleaned from the family image. One of the more unsettling cover-ups was hiding in plain sight. A pair of royal cousins, quietly institutionalized, legally declared dead while still breathing, and erased from the family tree for decades, because nothing says duty quite like pretending your relatives don't exist. 19. Elizabeth II's uncle's secret divorce. In the royal family, divorce used to be the kind of word you whispered behind lace curtains, preferably into a teacup. Before Diana, before Charles and Camilla, before tabloid headlines became just another arm of the monarchy's PR department, divorce was a constitutional embarrassment, a crack in the carefully constructed illusion of permanence. So when Elizabeth II's uncle, another son of George V, quietly parted ways with his wife, the separation wasn't just inconvenient, it was impermissible. The royal in question was Prince George, Duke of Kent. Yes, the same Prince George whose life ended in a mysterious plane crash in 1942. But what often gets brushed aside in the telling of his death is the private rupture that preceded it, a marital fracture that the palace tried desperately to hide, or at least to misfile. Prince George married Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark in 1934, in what was widely publicized as a glamorous royal union. She was elegant, stately, and very much suited to the role. He, by contrast, was already developing a reputation for excess, parties, affairs, and an inability to adhere to the quiet life of royal domesticity. Still, the marriage was celebrated with the usual pomp, and they had 3 children, including the current Duke of Kent. But by the late 1930s, their marriage had quietly unraveled. The couple spent increasing amounts of time apart, and insiders noted their growing coldness. George remained involved in the royal circuit, but his private life was, put delicately, complicated. Reports swirled of affairs, some with women, some rumored with men. Marina, for her part, maintained her composure, appearing dutiful in public but retreating from the personal life they once shared. Friends of the family later remarked that the two had effectively separated well before George's death. Yet there's no record of a divorce. Not officially. And that's where things get interesting. Several biographers and royal historians have claimed that Prince George and Princess Marina may have undergone a private separation agreement, or even a secret civil divorce that was quietly handled through legal proxies and without formal announcement. No announcement. No press release. No scandal. Just a legal mechanism hidden within a labyrinth of aristocratic discretion. Not because they feared public outrage. By then, the upper classes had their own histories of separation, but because royalty couldn't be seen failing at something so ordinary. Especially not a sibling of the king. The Church of England, of course, frowned deeply upon divorce at the time, particularly among its highest-profile representatives. To admit a royal marriage had failed was to admit the family was fallible, that their marriages were like anyone else's, messy, emotional, subject to boredom, infidelity, and fatigue. And so, the story was rephrased. George was busy with royal duties. Marina was supporting her family in Greece. The distance was excused, the frost disguised as formality. Then, in 1942, George died in a plane crash, and with him, any potential records, confessions, or legal documents that might have confirmed a quiet, off-the-books divorce. Marina remained the Dowager Duchess of Kent for the rest of her life, and the family closed ranks around the old narrative. A loving royal couple, torn apart too soon by tragedy. But even after his death, the gaps remained. Letters missing. Personal effects lost in the wreckage. Legal documents that had supposedly existed, never found. It wasn't a cover-up with flashing neon signs. It was the kind where the paper trail simply stopped. That style of cover-up, absence over denial, would become increasingly useful as the decades went on. Because the next royal scandal involved someone even closer to the crown, Lord Louis Mountbatten, war hero, family patriarch, and a man whose carefully manicured legacy left out entire chapters. Some of them still sealed, some of them still too dangerous to print. 20. Lord Louis Mountbatten's hidden scandals. To the public, he was the perfect royal operator, dignified, decorated, and dead at just the right moment. Lord Louis Mountbatten, 1st Earl of Burma, has been called many things: naval hero, last Viceroy of India, architect of royal marriages, mentor to princes. His portraits hang in museums. His name graces battleships and boulevards. But behind the uniform, the medals, and the dry official biographies lies something messier. Something the monarchy and the British state has worked hard to keep quiet. Mountbatten was a master of reinvention. Born into the Battenberg family, he anglicized his name during World War I to avoid anti-German sentiment, becoming Mountbatten in time to craft a clean British identity. He climbed through the ranks of the Royal Navy, led operations in World War II, and rebranded himself as a worldly diplomat during Britain's chaotic retreat from empire. By the 1950s, he had positioned himself as the royal family's favorite uncle, the fixer, the confidant, the man who helped arrange the marriage of Prince Philip, his nephew, to the young Princess Elizabeth. But that's the version you're supposed to remember, the version with cut-glass diction and naval honor, the censored version. Because away from the official record, Mountbatten's life was peppered with rumors, red flags, and classified files, many of which are still locked behind government seals under the logic of national security. Which raises the obvious question: what kind of scandal could a retired royal uncle possibly pose to the security of a modern democracy? For decades, whispers about Mountbatten's private life hovered in the background. Former staff, foreign intelligence officers, and declassified documents have all suggested a pattern of questionable associations and inappropriate relationships. Some pointed to his unusually close friendships with much younger men, particularly among his staff and naval retinue. Others noted his strange presence at social circles that blurred the lines between aristocracy and secrecy. Elite boarding schools, political clubs, and luxury resorts where discretion was the only rule. In 2019, newly unsealed FBI files revealed that the U.S. intelligence community had long kept an eye on Mountbatten, describing him in internal memos as a homosexual with a perversion for young boys. The British press barely touched the story. The palace didn't comment. And unlike other scandals, there was no wave of lawsuits or denials, just silence, the kind that sounds a lot like agreement. The British government has kept several files on Mountbatten sealed long past their expected release date. Requests under the Freedom of Information Act have been repeatedly denied. The rationale? Releasing the material would damage international relations or endanger diplomatic trust. Curious language for a man whose life was supposedly so honorable, so unimpeachable that he was buried with full state honors. Then there are the allegations about Northern Ireland, where Mountbatten had a country estate in Mullaghmore, and where intelligence officers later suggested he may have had access to circles connected to child exploitation. These remain unproven, uninvestigated, and deeply sensitive. But the timing of his death in 1979, assassinated by an IRA bomb, has conveniently frozen his public image in place. He died a war hero, a symbol of British resilience. And the dead, especially the royally connected ones, don't speak. Mountbatten's legacy was quickly secured by the establishment. Books written, plaques unveiled, controversial claims minimized as slander or Cold War gossip. But among historians and former intelligence personnel, the questions have never gone away. They just aren't asked in polite society. And still, the royal family carried on invoking his name, especially when disciplining the next generation. But not all his relatives were so easily managed, because while Lord Mountbatten's secrets were buried beneath statecraft and security classifications, two royal cousins were buried by something even colder: bureaucracy. Women hidden not for what they'd done but for what they couldn't do, functioned publicly. And the institution solution was as old as monarchy itself: lock the doors, lose the files, and pretend they were never there. 21. The Queen Mother's institutionalized nieces. There are royal scandals that roar through history. Affairs, abdications, whispered treasons. And then there are the ones that don't make a sound. Not because they're less cruel, but because they're less visible. The story of Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, nieces of the Queen Mother, first cousins to Queen Elizabeth II, is one of the quietest, most chilling cover-ups in the history of the British monarchy. It wasn't a scandal born of crime or betrayal. It was born of inconvenience. And like so many royal secrets, it was buried not with noise, but with silence. Nerissa and Catherine were the daughters of John Bowes-Lyon, the Queen Mother's brother. This made them part of the extended royal family, born with titles, bloodlines, and expectations. But as they grew, it became apparent that both girls had significant developmental disabilities. In an era where cognitive impairments were not understood, and certainly not accepted within the ranks of aristocracy, their condition was immediately labeled a problem. The solution? Disappear them. In 1941, Nerissa and Catherine were committed to the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Red Hill, Surrey, a bleak institution that housed people with a range of mental disabilities. They were not the only aristocrats confined there. Several other distant royal relatives were reportedly admitted as well. But they were certainly the highest ranking. Despite their lineage, the sisters lived in the hospital under the most basic conditions, with no visitors, no royal privileges, and, critically, no public acknowledgement of their existence. The most grotesque twist came decades later, when Burke's Peerage, the encyclopedic record of the British aristocracy, listed both women as dead. Nerissa was falsely recorded as having died in 1940. In fact, she lived until 1986. Catherine lived until 2014. They were alive, institutionalized, forgotten, legally misfiled. Why did it happen? The official explanation, when the story surfaced in the 1980s, was that it had been a clerical error, a paperwork glitch, a misunderstanding. The Queen Mother's office issued a vague statement expressing sadness, but not responsibility. It was implied that she had not known of the girls' conditions, or perhaps had not been kept informed of their whereabouts. But letters and documents discovered later suggest otherwise. At the very least, the royal family knew they had two relatives who had vanished from public life. At worst, they were complicit in ensuring they stayed gone. Hospital staff were reportedly aware of the sisters' identities and nicknamed them the princesses. They watched as the women aged, rarely spoken of, never visited. Their lives reduced to routine, meals, medication, the occasional walk in a walled garden. They received no birthday messages, no Christmas cards, no personal effects. The monarchy, so fond of family photo ops and holiday speeches, had edited them out of the frame entirely. When the truth emerged, it wasn't through a royal admission. It was through investigative journalism and a few stubborn reporters who asked why cousins of the Queen had seemingly vanished from the public record. Even then, the royal response was muted. There was no apology, no effort to honor them in death, no public acknowledgement from the Queen herself, just more silence. The story, briefly a tabloid sensation, faded from headlines, but its implications never quite vanished, because it showed how far the monarchy would go to maintain the illusion of perfection, not just in public life but in private blood. It revealed a system where the inconvenient are not confronted but concealed, where weakness is not addressed but locked away, and where the definition of family stops just short of empathy. It also exposed a strategy the palace would deploy again, especially when the threat wasn't a forgotten cousin, but a future king entangled in a forbidden love affair. Because if hiding relatives behind closed doors was one form of control, denying a relationship altogether was its more polished sibling. And when Charles met Camilla, the palace didn't hide him. It simply pretended she wasn't there. 22. Prince Charles and Camilla's early affair. Before it became a royal love story with a happy ending, or at least a heavily rebranded one, the relationship between Prince Charles and Camilla Shand was treated by the monarchy not as romance, but as a liability, a growing risk to the reputation of the heir to the throne. So what did the royal establishment do? The same thing it always does when confronted with an inconvenient emotional truth. It covered it up, rewrote it, and buried the rest beneath a mountain of vague statements and silent nods. Prince Charles met Camilla in the early 1970s. Depending on who tells the story, they either fell instantly into a warm, irreverent rapport or slid naturally into the sort of friendship that only ever leads one way when two people are kept in constant proximity and emotional repression is the only rule. Camilla, witty and relaxed in a way that most debutantes were trained not to be, had little patience for court protocol. Charles, constantly surrounded by rigid expectations, found that quality intoxicating. They were, by most accounts, in love. But love alone doesn't crown a king. And Camilla, divorced, non-virginal, and more fond of the countryside than the spotlight, was never going to be deemed suitable by the people who made decisions about the royal brand. Behind closed doors, courtiers plotted her exit from Charles's life like she was a troublesome staff member who had overstayed her welcome. In 1973, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles, a cavalry officer who was himself no stranger to royal circles or to royal indiscretions. Charles was away at sea with the Royal Navy at the time, reportedly heartbroken but boxed in by the expectations of duty. Camilla, now married, was conveniently sidelined. But the affair didn't end. In fact, it deepened. Throughout Charles's courtship of Diana Spencer in the early 1980s, Camilla remained in his life, if not always in the foreground. There were phone calls, meetings, overlapping holidays. The palace staff knew, friends knew, even Diana famously knew. And yet, the official version was silence. Photographers who caught glimpses of Charles and Camilla together were discouraged from publishing. Royal press officers denied the relationship outright or suggested they were old family friends. No mention was made of the affection that never disappeared, the emotional dependency that grew year by year, or the fact that Charles never truly let Camilla go, even after he married Diana. When Camilla's name did surface in press speculation, she was treated as a footnote, a married woman whose connection to the prince was overstated. There were no firm denials, but no confirmations either. Instead, the public was fed the fairy tale: Charles, the noble prince, and Diana, the radiant virgin bride. A match that ticked every constitutional and cosmetic box. It looked perfect, because it had to. The reality, of course, was anything but. Charles remained emotionally tied to Camilla throughout his marriage to Diana, even as the institution pressured him to maintain appearances. Camilla, often cast as the villain by tabloids and public sentiment, became the scapegoat for a system that refused to acknowledge that love might not align with optics. When news of the affair finally broke into public consciousness, through leaks, gossip, and, eventually, a tabloid-fueled media storm, the palace did what it had trained itself to do: damage control. And a large part of that involved erasing just how long the affair had been going on, pretending it was a late-stage failure, not a slow-burn betrayal that had festered since before Charles ever walked down the aisle. The early affair wasn't denied, it was retroactively reframed. But not all secrets can be stage-managed. Some escape the walls, some are caught on tape, and when Charles and Camilla's private conversations were recorded and leaked to the public in the 1990s, the royal PR machine couldn't hide behind silence anymore. What had once been plausible deniability became undeniable embarrassment. And the most infamous phone call in royal history would turn the quiet scandal into an uncontainable mess, one the crown would be cleaning up for decades. 23. Prince Andrew's Kincora Boys' home. Links allegations. There are scandals that burst into headlines like firecrackers. Loud, chaotic, impossible to ignore. And then there are those that seep in through cracks in the foundation, buried under bureaucracy, rumor, and time. The Kinkora Boys' home scandal belongs to the second category. And somewhere on the edges of that sordid, deliberately forgotten tragedy, the name of a British royal emerged, not center stage, not confirmed, but whispered, hinted, and redacted just enough to make the omission feel deliberate. The name was Prince Andrew. The Kinkora Boys' home, located in Belfast, Northern Ireland, operated from the 1950s until the early 1980s. On the surface, it was a state-run care home for vulnerable boys. In reality, it became the center of one of the darkest child abuse scandals in the United Kingdom. The staff, particularly housemaster William McGrath, were found to have sexually abused boys over many years. But the abuse wasn't just an isolated failure of one institution. It involved alleged collusion with intelligence services, the suppression of complaints, and a far more sinister suggestion that the home was being used, either actively or passively, by elements of British intelligence to compromise influential men. What followed was a complex web of cover-ups, half-truths, and unanswered questions. Several inquiries were launched, each promising to go wherever the evidence leads, and each somehow stopping just short of the truth. Some documents were sealed, some witnesses were ignored, some leads were declared unsubstantiated despite their consistency across testimonies. And then came the rumors, persistent, unsettling, and always just vague enough to escape libel laws. Among these rumors were claims that high-profile individuals, including politicians, clergy, and members of the military, had visited or been associated with Kinkora. And, most controversially, that someone connected to the royal family had been named in suppressed witness statements or private intelligence files. It was during the 1990s and 2000s, as journalists and survivors began pressing harder for answers, that Prince Andrew's name first began to surface in conspiracy forums, unofficial leaks, and guarded comments from those involved in the early stages of the inquiry. To be clear, no public inquiry has ever formally confirmed Andrew's involvement, and no official accusation has ever been leveled against him in connection to Kinkora. But that, in a way, is the problem. The name surfaced often enough to attract legal warnings, press silence, and aggressive pushback from palace representatives. Requests for access to intelligence documents relating to Kinkora were repeatedly denied on the grounds of national security. Witnesses who claimed knowledge of high-profile visitors were discredited, marginalized, or quietly ignored. Journalists who investigated the royal angle were threatened with lawsuits or steered away by editors. The deeper they dug, the more resistance they encountered, not from official denials, but from walls of silence. Why the resistance, if the connection was baseless? That question has never been satisfactorily answered, and in the vacuum left by ambiguity, the public has been left to fill in the blanks. Was Andrew one of the many figures whose names were simply erased from the official record? Was his presence inferred, mistaken, or deliberately obscured? Or was it something even murkier? An intelligence operation that went so deep, even the crown didn't have full control over the fallout. The royal family has never addressed the Kinkora allegations directly. No public statement, no lawsuits, no clarifications. The strategy has been consistent. Total silence, coupled with the confident assumption that the topic is too toxic, too convoluted, and too buried in red tape for anyone to seriously pursue. But the shadow remains. Because silence doesn't erase suspicion, it confirms it. And in a family already skilled in the art of erasure, there's always someone else waiting in the wings. Someone with a different kind of scandal. One that's less about silence and more about spectacle. Because while Prince Andrew's alleged ties were buried under secrecy, Princess Margaret's exploits were front-page material, until the palace made sure they weren't. 24. Princess Margaret's lovers and suppressed press stories. If Queen Elizabeth II was duty in pearls, Princess Margaret was rebellion in Dior. She was the one who lit the cigarette rather than waved at the crowd, who entered rooms sideways with a martini in one hand and a scandal barely behind her. For decades, she was the royal family's glamorous liability, the sister who could be neither controlled nor properly explained. But for all her visibility, the public only ever saw part of the picture. The rest was carefully trimmed by palace hands and cooperative editors. Because while Margaret lived in the spotlight, her messier truths were handled like all royal inconveniences, with strategic omission and quiet suppression. Margaret's reputation as a party girl wasn't entirely inaccurate, but it was incomplete. From the 1950s through the 1970s, she cultivated a lifestyle that could only be described as aristocratic bohemia. She moved through artists, actors, writers, and socialites like a royal comet. Her circle included the likes of Peter Sellers, Mick Jagger, and ballet dancer Rudolf Nureyev. These weren't casual acquaintances. These were people who saw the real Margaret, charming, witty, volatile, and occasionally reckless. She had affairs, many of them. Some were whispered about in drawing rooms. Others were known in Fleet Street newsrooms, but never printed. And some, like her decade-long entanglement with landscape gardener Roddy Llewellyn, who was 17 years her junior, eventually burst into public view, too scandalous to be ignored even by the obedient British press. But by the time Roddy entered the picture, the palace had already spent years suppressing stories about Margaret's private life. Earlier lovers, especially during the 1950s and 1960s, were erased from the narrative in real time. Journalists who dared report on them were pressured by royal courtiers. Editors were reminded of their patriotic duty. Royal correspondents knew the unspoken rules. Write what flatters, ignore what embarrasses. In return, they were given access, quotes, and the illusion of journalistic privilege. Margaret's affair with Group Captain Peter Townsend was perhaps the most famous of her romantic misadventures. It was framed as a tragic love story, royal woman forbidden to marry a divorced man. In reality, it was more complicated. Margaret could have waited. She could have fought. But the institution needed the appearance of moral uprightness more than it needed Margaret to be happy. Her heartbreak was public, but the real cost of that decision was never fully explained. Nor was the fact that, after Townsend, she became increasingly untethered, romantically, emotionally, and politically. The stories that didn't make the papers are more telling than the ones that did. Alleged affairs with married men, photographs taken at private villas that were never published, reports of wild parties in Mustique with celebrities and minor aristocrats, where substances and allegiances blurred. And still, the narrative held. Princess Margaret, troubled but loyal. Rebellious but royal. Even her marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones, later Lord Snowdon, was steeped in contradiction. Sold to the public as a modern artistic match, the marriage descended quickly into mutual resentment, infidelity, and silence. Snowdon's affairs were well known within their circle. So were Margaret's. But only the most sanitized version made it into public discourse. The real bitterness, the late-night shouting matches, the coldness, the chaos, remained behind palace curtains. When the couple divorced in 1978, it was a royal first. And yet, even then, the full truth was softened. Margaret was cast as the tragic royal once more, aging, alone, misunderstood. There was no mention of the press deals that kept certain names out of print, or the photographers who were paid to not publish certain frames. Margaret was never allowed to be ordinary, but the palace never allowed her to be fully extraordinary either. She was reduced to a lesson, how not to behave, and that narrative, carefully constructed and cruelly maintained, has followed her even in death. But she wasn't the only royal whose reputation was airbrushed into posthumous simplicity. Because in the same family, another George, a cousin, a pilot, a prince, was smoothed into silence. Not for what he did in life, but for what he might have believed. A man with alleged Nazi sympathies who died before the questions could. 25. The Queen's cousin, Prince George's Nazi sympathies. In a family where names repeat like echoes, George, Edwards, Charleses, it's easy to lose track of who's who. But one George in particular has a tendency to vanish from memory faster than the rest. Prince George, Duke of Kent. Not the more familiar George VI, but his younger brother. The glamorous one, the mysterious one. The one whose death in a wartime plane crash raised eyebrows, and whose politics, if we're being generous, raised alarms. To most of the public, Prince George was the royal with movie star good looks, impeccable tailoring, and a penchant for high society. He was a naval officer, a father of 3, and a part-time public figure with an aristocratic glow. But for those who studied the royal family's wartime history a bit more closely, George's name began appearing in uncomfortable places. Namely, in conversations about pre-war aristocratic flirtations with fascism, and more specifically, the troubling entanglement between segments of the British upper class and Nazi Germany. The 1930s were an uneasy time for the British establishment. The rise of fascism on the continent had divided opinion within elite circles. Some viewed Hitler's regime with horror. Others, particularly those with anti-communist leanings and traditionalist values, saw it as a kind of orderly antidote to the chaos of modernity. And in that murky gray zone, you find names you wouldn't expect, including George. While there's no smoking gun proving that Prince George was an open Nazi sympathizer, there's more than enough circumstantial evidence to raise the question. He moved in the same social circles as known appeasers and members of the Anglo-German Fellowship, a group that sought friendship between Britain and Nazi Germany. His brother, Edward VIII, was already well documented in his sympathies, having visited Hitler and expressed admiration for the regime. George's connections were more subtle, but no less troubling. Whispers emerged that George had attended gatherings where pro-German sentiment was expressed, that he had maintained friendships with individuals later identified as Nazi sympathizers, and that he was part of a royal and aristocratic clique that saw fascism not as a threat, but as a stabilizing force. Was this naivete, political ignorance, or something more deliberate? When George died in 1942 in a mysterious plane crash in northern Scotland, those questions should have been answered. Instead, they were buried, along with the prince. The crash itself was suspicious from the start. George was aboard a military aircraft with a curious flight plan and an unusual passenger manifest. The official inquiry attributed the crash to pilot error. But key documents went missing, records were sealed, and speculation grew that George had been on a secret diplomatic mission, or worse, a back-channel communication effort with Germany. Some theories, admittedly wild, suggested he was attempting to broker a separate peace behind Churchill's back. What's known for certain is that his death was convenient. He had begun to raise questions about war, about peace, and about Britain's role in both. And just as those questions became more dangerous, the prince disappeared, literally from the sky. In the years following the war, George's image was swiftly sanitized. Photographs of him in uniform became standard. His death was repackaged as noble and tragic. His friendships were quietly forgotten. And his potential political leanings? Left unrecorded. To this day, the royal family rarely speaks of Prince George. His name appears in footnotes, his memory preserved only in the vaguest terms. A royal who died young, serving his country. Nothing more. Nothing less. Nothing that could stain the family's wartime narrative. But if George's story was erased for what he might have believed, others were silenced for who they knew. Because decades later, another royal scandal would explode, not from political leanings, but from a personal connection that reached deep into a criminal underworld. A prince, a billionaire, a now infamous name, Jeffrey Epstein. And once again, the palace would find itself scrambling for silence. 26. Prince Andrew and Jeffrey Epstein. In the long and storied tradition of royal cover-ups, Prince Andrew's entanglement with Jeffrey Epstein stands apart, not just for its scale or media saturation, but for the sheer persistence with which the monarchy tried to pretend it wasn't happening. Unlike older scandals that could be quietly erased or hidden behind locked archives, this one happened in the internet era. The receipts were digital, the photographs global, and the damage very much real. And yet, the palace stuck to its oldest trick: deny, delay, distract, and, if all else fails, disappear the man himself from public life. To understand how deep this scandal runs, we need to look past the headlines and into the years of cultivated silence that preceded them. Because Prince Andrew didn't meet Jeffrey Epstein in 2010, or 2009, or even 2006, when Epstein was first arrested. He met him in the early 2000s, introduced through Ghislaine Maxwell, a socialite with her own tangled royal connections and a long-standing friendship with Andrew. From that point forward, Epstein and Andrew moved in overlapping circles: dinner parties, private jets, lavish estates, and high society events where wealth excused everything. Even after Epstein's first conviction in 2008, when he was found guilty of procuring a minor for prostitution and sentenced to a cushy, controversial plea deal, Prince Andrew maintained contact. He stayed in Epstein's New York mansion. He was photographed walking with him in Central Park. He was seen attending dinner parties filled with names that would later become toxic. The defense from Buckingham Palace was always the same. They were acquaintances. Their contact was limited, and the prince regretted the association. That word, regret, would become central to the palace's narrative. It allowed Andrew to express mild contrition without admitting wrongdoing. He wasn't guilty, just poorly advised. He wasn't complicit, just naive. It was a performance of accountability with all the sincerity of a press release. And yet, even that limited version of regret was too little, too late. The real damage came with the accusations of Virginia Giuffre, who alleged that she had been trafficked by Epstein and forced into sexual encounters with Andrew while she was still a minor under U.S. law. The allegations were serious. They were specific. And most critically, they came with evidence. Photos of Andrew with Giuffre, standing beside Ghislaine Maxwell in a London townhouse, his hand on her waist. The kind of photo that isn't supposed to exist, let alone circulate globally. Andrew denied everything. He claimed to have no memory of meeting her. He claimed he was at a Pizza Express in Woking on the night in question. The denial was so implausible, so bizarrely specific, that it became a national punchline. And then came that interview, the BBC's now infamous Newsnight special in 2019. Intended as a platform to clear his name, it instead buried him in contradictions, robotic deflections, and a catastrophic lack of empathy. Within days, the palace pulled the emergency brake. Andrew was stepping back from royal duties. His patronages vanished. Public appearances were canceled. His name was removed from official statements. For all intents and purposes, he was ghosted by his own family. But the cover-up didn't stop. It evolved. Settlement negotiations were launched behind closed doors. Andrew paid an undisclosed sum to Giuffre in 2022, an agreement that explicitly included no admission of guilt. The royal press machine kicked into gear, shifting the narrative toward rehabilitation. A brief appearance at Prince Philip's memorial. A handshake here, a walk there. Small, carefully calculated steps to test public tolerance. It didn't work. Public trust had been shattered. The monarchy's handling of Andrew was seen not as justice but damage control. The firm had protected the brand, not the people harmed. The documents, many sealed, many redacted, remain locked away. The FBI investigation into Epstein's network continues, with key royal names still floating in its periphery. And once again, a truth had been managed rather than confronted, not erased but strategically muffled. A familiar formula, allowed just enough light to escape so that the whole structure doesn't collapse, but never so much that the rot is fully revealed. Still, even in scandal, the Windsors know how to prioritize. Because while Prince Andrew was being quietly sidelined, another PR storm was brewing. One with microphones, transcripts, and a tape the monarchy desperately hoped would never surface. But surface it did. A conversation between Prince Charles and Camilla. Private, absurd, humiliating, and caught forever on tape. 27. Prince Charles's 1990s phone tapes with Camilla. There are few moments in royal history that feel like a collective national cringe, the kind that makes headlines, parody sketches, late-night talk shows, and international ridicule all at once. For Prince Charles, that moment arrived in January 1993, when a grainy recording of a private phone call between him and Camilla Parker Bowles leaked to the press. Known forever as Tampongate, it wasn't just a public relations disaster. It was a glimpse behind the curtain, not into crime or corruption, but into something almost more dangerous for the monarchy: embarrassing humanity. The story broke in The People, a Sunday tabloid, a transcript of an intimate late-night conversation, recorded surreptitiously years earlier in 1989, when Charles was still married to Princess Diana and Camilla still married to Andrew Parker Bowles, landed in the hands of journalists. Initially dismissed as a hoax, the tape's authenticity was quickly confirmed, and the palace braced for impact. It wasn't just the flirtation that shocked the public, it was the language. During the call, Charles joked that he wanted to live inside Camilla's trousers, then added, "God forbid, a Tampax, just my luck." In an instant, the heir to the British throne, the future Supreme Governor of the Church of England, was reduced to the punchline of every comedian in Europe. Tabloids had a field day. Satirical shows rewrote the monarchy's script as softcore farce. Late-night comedians in the U.S. called it royal flush. And suddenly, the well-cultivated image of Prince Charles as a dutiful, melancholic prince was obliterated by the revelation that he was also a man with desires, a man who spoke awkwardly when trying to be intimate, and a man whose private life had long since diverged from the one depicted in Buckingham Palace press releases. The palace's initial strategy was to remain silent. The transcripts were labeled an invasion of privacy. No statements were made, no lawsuits were filed. The public, it was hoped, would tire of the story. But behind the scenes, damage control was in overdrive. The royal PR machine leaned heavily on the idea that the recording was from years earlier, before Charles's marriage had irretrievably broken down. Lawyers attempted to block further reprints. Royal correspondents were quietly discouraged from covering the story in depth. Diana, for her part, remained silent publicly. But her revenge came in the form of calculated elegance, appearances in black dresses, leaks to friendly journalists, a slow, deliberate reframing of herself as the wronged woman. Meanwhile, Camilla became a national villain, branded as the other woman, a homewrecker, a scandal in pearls. The monarchy, terrified of the emotional mess unraveling in public, doubled down on sanitizing the future. Charles was urged to project more gravitas. Camilla was kept out of official events. Public appearances were micromanaged. Everything that could be controlled was controlled. But nothing could erase the sound of that tape, the unfiltered, unscripted version of the prince who was supposed to symbolize duty above all else. In the years that followed, Charles and Camilla would slowly rehabilitate their image. Marriages ended, Apologies were made. Time did its work. Eventually they married in 2005 in a ceremony deliberately modest, civil, and carefully distanced from the grandeur of royal tradition. But Tampongate never truly disappeared. It became shorthand for the monarchy's greatest vulnerability, not revolution, not scandal, but humiliation. The kind that couldn't be erased from memory. The kind that was funny because it was real. And if that tape cracked the surface of the crown's glossy veneer, the next chapter shattered it. Because just a few years later, the monarchy would face a moment that could not be denied, delayed, or disguised. A car crash, a tunnel in Paris, and a Princess of Wales who would never come home. 28. Diana's Death Investigations. For a monarchy built on symbolism, the death of Princess Diana in 1997 was nothing short of catastrophic. Not just because the nation lost its people's princess, but because, for the first time in living memory, the royal family's well-practiced detachment collided violently with a tidal wave of public grief and suspicion. Diana didn't die in a palace. She died in a tunnel, not in service to the crown, but in escape from it. And almost immediately, the world began to ask a question the monarchy wasn't prepared to answer. What really happened? The official story is well known. In the early hours of August 31, 1997, Diana, along with her companion Dodi Fayed and their driver Henry Paul, was killed when their Mercedes crashed in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. They were being pursued by paparazzi. The driver was later found to be intoxicated. A tragic accident, the authorities said, open and shut. Except it wasn't. From the very beginning, the circumstances surrounding Diana's death felt off. The delay in medical assistance, the peculiar behavior of the French authorities, the missing CCTV footage from the tunnel, the fact that Diana's body was embalmed almost immediately, before a post-mortem, and before her family even arrived. For a public still raw from her bitter separation from the royal family, it wasn't hard to imagine a darker explanation. And for Mohammed Al-Fayed, Dodi's father, darker explanations were all but guaranteed. Al-Fayed openly accused the royal family of orchestrating the crash. He claimed the establishment couldn't bear the thought of Diana marrying a Muslim. He suggested the intelligence services were involved, that Diana was pregnant, that she was murdered to preserve the purity of the royal bloodline. The palace, predictably, said nothing. As always, silence was safer than engagement. Over the years, multiple investigations were launched. The French authorities concluded it was an accident. The British Metropolitan Police launched Operation Paget in 2004, a sprawling inquiry that took 3 years and cost millions. Its conclusion? No conspiracy, no murder, just poor decisions, a drunk driver, and a relentless press corps. But even Operation Paget acknowledged unsettling details. The missing security footage, the strange handling of evidence, the fact that Diana had written a letter to her butler predicting she might be killed in a car accident. "My husband is planning an accident in my car," she wrote. "Brake failure and serious head injury." It was dismissed as paranoia at the time. But once she was gone, it read like prophecy. Then there was the royal family's response. Perhaps the most damaging detail of all. In the days following Diana's death, the Queen remained silent. The flags at Buckingham Palace stayed at full mast. There were no public statements, no appearances. While the country wept openly in the streets, the monarchy seemed frozen in Victorian mourning protocol, as if unsure whether Diana still counted as one of them. It was only after an extraordinary wave of public anger that the palace adjusted its stance. The Queen finally made a televised address. The Union Jack was flown at half-mast. A state-style funeral was arranged, complete with royal presence. But by then, the damage was done. A new narrative had taken hold, not just of grief, but of distrust. To this day, a portion of the public still believes Diana's death was not an accident. That somewhere, someone made sure she wouldn't become the mother of a child outside royal control, or the ex-wife with too much influence, or the woman who knew too much. Conspiracy theories flourish in silence, and the palace's refusal to engage only fueled them. What remains is the uneasy truth that the monarchy couldn't, or wouldn't, protect her. And perhaps, in the minds of some, didn't want to. Still, history rolled on. New faces emerged, new scandals followed, and eventually, the next generation of royals began to stumble into their own disasters. Some, like Prince Harry, would be scrutinized endlessly. Others, like his older brother William, were protected by a media machine that remembered the lessons of Diana well. So when William's university years got a little too wild, the palace didn't wait for the press to find the photos. They made sure those photos never saw the light of day. 29. Prince Harry's Nazi costume scandal, 2005. In the long tradition of royal missteps, very few land with the kind of explosive cultural tone deafness that Prince Harry managed to deliver in January 2005. He was 20 years old, third in line to the throne, and just weeks away from enrolling at Sandhurst Military Academy, the supposed final stop on his path from wild child to respectable royal. But instead of a redemption arc, Harry showed up on the front page of The Sun wearing a Nazi uniform. Not in satire, not in drama, at a party. The theme was Natives and Colonials, which already tells you more than you'd like to know about the kind of party it was. Harry attended dressed in a khaki uniform complete with a swastika armband, reportedly purchased from a costume shop in Gloucestershire. He posed for pictures. He laughed. At least one of those photos found its way to the tabloids. And by morning, the country was staring at its prince, grinning like a schoolboy, dressed as a member of the regime that led to the Second World War and the Holocaust. The backlash was immediate. Politicians called it disgraceful. Jewish groups condemned the imagery as deeply offensive and historically illiterate. Holocaust survivors gave interviews wondering aloud how someone raised at the heart of British national memory could be so catastrophically oblivious. International headlines ran with it. Prince Harry's shame, royal outrage, heir and error. Within hours, Clarence House released a statement. Prince Harry has apologized for any offense or embarrassment he has caused. He realizes it was a poor choice of costume, and we are very sorry if it has caused offense. If the apology, carefully worded and noticeably light on ownership, was meant to quell the storm. It didn't. The story rolled on for days, not just because of what Harry wore, but because of what it symbolized. A deeply insulated royal culture, one where consequences were theoretical and historical memory optional. This wasn't just a young man behaving badly. It was the son of Princess Diana, whose public legacy was built on compassion and conscience. And it cut hard against the image the palace had tried to shape for him. Cheeky, rebellious, but essentially good-hearted. Behind the scenes, the palace scrambled. PR consultants were brought in. Internal reviews were quietly ordered. The photo leak was traced, but never publicly punished. More importantly, damage control shifted from Harry's behavior to the institution's strategy. How do you turn this into a lesson learned? And thus began the first major public rebranding of Prince Harry. Within a year, he was in army fatigues, not a costume, training with the British military, participating in charity work, speaking more carefully, walking straighter. The public was encouraged to view the scandal as youthful stupidity, a boys will be boys moment with a Windsor twist. But the image stuck. It would trail him for years, especially as he began to advocate for mental health, racial justice, and press reform. The irony was never lost. A man once photographed in a swastika lecturing the world about dignity and inclusion. To his credit, Harry later acknowledged how wrong the moment had been. In interviews, he called it one of the biggest mistakes of his life. In the Netflix docuseries Harry and Meghan, he even admitted that the royal family did not guide him well afterward, that there was little education, no serious conversation, just optics management. A missed opportunity, buried under headlines. The scandal didn't end his public life, but it permanently altered its tone. From that point on, Harry would be walking uphill, and eventually he'd walk away entirely. But for a time, the royal PR machine succeeded in containing the fallout, just as it had done with countless scandals before. Because the Windsors had learned something valuable over the years. If a story is caught early enough, if the press plays ball, and if the photos don't leak, then it might never even exist in the public imagination. Which brings us to a prince who enjoyed far more of that institutional protection. William, the golden boy, the heir, the one who was supposed to be unbreakable. And when his younger years veered into questionable territory, the palace made sure it stayed off camera, buried, or blocked entirely. Because when you're grooming a future king, not even drunken escapades or party mishaps can be allowed to reach the front page. 30. Prince William's University, partying. Before Prince William became the polished, carefully curated figure of royal responsibility, a man with the right wife, the right hairline, briefly, and the right blend of stoicism and charm, he was just a university student at St. Andrews. And like many students who suddenly find themselves away from home, he partied. A lot. But unlike most students, William's nights out were protected by a press blackout so complete, it may as well have been issued under the Official Secrets Act. In 2001, William enrolled at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, choosing to study art history, later switching to geography. The move was strategic. It placed him far from London, the press, and the relentless chaos that followed his mother's death. But more importantly, it offered something even rarer, plausible deniability. Because what happened in St. Andrews mostly stayed in St. Andrews, at least as far as the British press was concerned. From the start, palace aides arranged what would become known as the media blackout deal. In exchange for occasional staged photo calls and controlled access, the press agreed not to pursue or publish details about William's day-to-day life as a student. No paps, no gossip columns, no party photos, no matter how wild the night. And wild they were. William was often seen at local pubs like Ma Bell's and the Lizard Lounge. Witnesses described nights of heavy drinking, table dancing, flirtations, and the occasional costume party. There were whispered stories of themed nights, drinking games, and behavior that wouldn't have raised eyebrows for any other 20-year-old, but looked a little different when you're second in line to the throne. There was also the infamous Thistle Ball, an end-of-term party involving kilts, champagne, and no shortage of blacked-out memories. Fellow students and staff later admitted that the university's administration went out of its way to protect the prince's privacy, even when things got messy. And then there was Kate. Kate Middleton, his flatmate turned girlfriend, entered the picture early in his university years. The famous fashion show where she walked the runway in a sheer dress, and William reportedly leaned over to say, "Wow," has been immortalized as the moment he saw her differently. But their relationship, though presented as a royal love story of fairy tale proportions, wasn't without complications. Breakups, reconciliations, and rumored jealousies played out behind closed doors, never leaked to the public. The royal media operation, still scarred from Diana's tabloid wars, made sure of that. The deal with the press worked. For a while. Foreign outlets occasionally published grainy photos of William appearing worse for wear outside a club, but British papers stayed silent. Stories were spiked. Photos were bought and buried. Even when reports emerged of drunken bets, pub scuffles, or near-naked dares, they were downplayed as youthful exuberance. The result was a carefully maintained illusion. Prince William, focused, disciplined, and on track to be a modern monarch. The reality was a lot more human and a lot more fun. But it was never about suppressing a scandal. It was about preserving a brand. The monarchy could survive an unruly spare. It could not afford a messy heir. That lesson, about the difference between what the public sees and what actually happens, has defined William's entire adult life. The monarchy's future depends on him appearing as stable as the institution itself, which means when things get uncomfortable, they get hidden. And few things were more uncomfortable for the crown than rumors about Prince Philip's personal life. Because while William's partying was quietly tolerated, Prince Philip's alleged affairs were buried altogether, with more than just press cooperation. With silence, steel, and sealed records. 31. Prince Philip's alleged affairs. For over 7 decades, Prince Philip stood 2 paces behind the Queen, her consort, her companion, and officially, her unwavering supporter. But offstage, behind the rigid smiles and diplomatic handshakes, Philip was rumored to be something else entirely. Charismatic, restless, and not particularly loyal. Though none of his alleged affairs were ever officially confirmed, they were whispered about for decades, and just as swiftly covered up. Philip married Elizabeth in 1947. By all public accounts, their union was built on mutual respect and affection. But Philip, a Navy man with a taste for freedom, never quite fit the mold of dutiful royal husband. He was charming, flirtatious, and famously allergic to stuffy convention. He once joked, "I couldn't care less what they say, as long as it's not true." It was the kind of line that both invited speculation and brushed it away in the same breath. Rumors of extramarital activity began circulating in the 1950s. As the Queen took on more responsibilities, Philip often traveled alone, for naval tours, charity work, or simply to escape the rigidity of palace life. It was during these solo excursions that whispers grew louder. One of the most persistent rumors involved British stage star Pat Kirkwood. The two were reportedly seen dining and dancing together in 1948, just weeks before Elizabeth gave birth to Prince Charles. Both Kirkwood and Philip denied any impropriety, but Kirkwood later lamented that the association had shadowed her entire career. Others claimed liaisons with aristocrats, actresses, and foreign dignitaries, never proven, always denied. The palace, for its part, never acknowledged the rumors. In fact, they treated them like they didn't exist. There were no public rebuttals, no legal threats, no clarifications, just silence, and a sharp understanding with the press. You don't touch the Queen's marriage, not unless you want to be frozen out for good. And it worked. Even as foreign tabloids occasionally teased scandalous headlines, "The women behind the prince," British outlets refused to engage. Editors were warned. Stories were spiked. The deal was simple. Protect the dignity of the crown, and you stay on the royal Christmas card list. To this day, there's no definitive evidence that Philip was unfaithful. But the absence of proof isn't quite the same as proof of absence. Former staff, palace insiders, and biographers have often spoken in code, referring to Philip's independence, restlessness, or devotion to discretion. The real cover-up wasn't just about suppressing names. It was about preserving the myth of royal infallibility. If the Queen's marriage could fracture, what else might unravel? Better to let the rumors live in the shadows than risk confirming them in the light. But while Philip's private life was kept safely vague, the royal family's finances were hidden in plain sight. For centuries, the question of how rich they really are, and how much the public subsidizes their opulence, has been met with evasions, loopholes, and sealed ledgers. Because when it comes to the monarchy, nothing is quite as untouchable as the money. 32. The cover-up of royal finances. When you ask how much the British royal family is worth, the answer tends to be a waltz rather than a figure. A few estimates here, a shrug there, some vague references to the Duchy of Cornwall, and a smile so polite it might as well be a wall. It's not just that the numbers are fuzzy, it's that they're designed to be. Because in the business of monarchy, appearances are everything, and nothing ruins a good fairy tale faster than a line-by-line breakdown of who's paying for the gold-plated radiator covers. The British monarchy has always relied on a delicate social contract, pomp in exchange for discretion, spectacle in exchange for silence. The public gets parades, weddings, and jubilee bunting. In return, the royal family gets a level of privacy and financial insulation that would make most billionaires jealous. But behind the pageantry lies one of the longest-running royal cover-ups in history. One not of scandal or romance, but of arithmetic. The root of the obfuscation lies in centuries of legal and financial entanglements, starting with the infamous civil list, introduced in 1760 when George III agreed to hand over the Crown Estate's revenue to the government in exchange for a fixed annual payment. The idea was to separate the monarch's personal wealth from the running costs of the state. What it actually did was blur the line between public and private money for generations. In 2012, the civil list was replaced with the sovereign grant, a single annual payment calculated as a percentage, initially 15%, later increased to 25%, of the profits from the Crown Estate. This gave the illusion of transparency. But the sovereign grant only covers the cost of official duties, travel, staffing, maintenance. It doesn't include the Duchy of Lancaster, the Queen's private income, the Duchy of Cornwall, now Williams, or the sprawling private assets hidden in trust funds and offshore holdings. In other words, the real money is off the books. Independent estimates of the royal family's total wealth vary wildly, from $500 million to over $28 billion. Depending on whether you count personal assets, inherited estates, priceless art collections, private investments, or the vague yet powerful category of cultural wealth. The crown jewels, for instance, are technically held in trust for the nation, but no one's about to sell them to balance the NHS budget. Attempts to audit royal finances have historically run into a brick wall. Royal wills, for instance, are sealed forever. When Prince Philip died in 2021, his will was locked away in a secret safe alongside over 30 others from deceased royals. Why? To protect the dignity of the crown, which is a poetic way of saying, we don't want you to know who got what. Journalists who investigate royal wealth often find themselves in a Kafkaesque maze of PR statements, legal ambiguities, and polite threats. Questions about how the royal train is maintained or how many palaces are funded by the taxpayer are redirected or ignored. Even Parliament has struggled to get straight answers. When MPs questioned the cost of Buckingham Palace renovations, initially budgeted at £369 million, officials cited security and national heritage, not accountability. In 2021, a Guardian investigation revealed that Queen Elizabeth II had, on multiple occasions, lobbied government ministers to alter legislation that would affect her private interests. Known as the Queen's Consent Mechanism, it allows the monarch to review and influence proposed laws that affect royal powers or finances before they're introduced. In one case, she successfully requested changes to exempt her private investments from a transparency law intended to prevent corruption. Nothing illegal, just helpful amendments. This carefully maintained opaqueness has real consequences. It makes it nearly impossible to assess the true public cost of the monarchy or to have a rational conversation about its value. The royal family, in effect, operates as a publicly funded private institution with all the prestige of government and none of the oversight. And yet, for all the financial fog, there was still one matter the palace couldn't entirely suppress, because it was locked in a safe on the other side of the world. It was a letter from a queen to a governor general. a document that, for decades, no one was allowed to read. And when it was finally unsealed, it exposed not just royal influence, but royal interference. 33. The Queen's sealed letters on the 1975 Australian dismissal. For a family that famously doesn't get involved in politics, the British royals have a habit of showing up at exactly the wrong constitutional moment. Nowhere was this more dramatically illustrated than in Australia in 1975, when the Queen's official representative, Governor-General Sir John Kerr, dismissed the sitting Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam. It was a constitutional earthquake. A democratically elected government was toppled not by a vote, not by scandal, but by the symbolic representative of a foreign monarch. For years, the question that haunted Australians wasn't just why it happened, but who knew. Whitlam's sacking on November 11, 1975, shocked the country. Kerr had acted unilaterally, using his constitutional power to remove the Prime Minister and install the opposition leader instead. Critics called it a coup. Supporters claimed it was a necessary move to break a parliamentary deadlock. But either way, attention quickly turned to the Queen. Was she aware of the decision beforehand? Did she approve of it? Did the palace pull strings from London? The royal response was swift and predictable. Absolutely not. The Queen, they insisted, had no knowledge of the dismissal before it happened. She had always acted on the advice of her ministers. The Crown was a figurehead, nothing more. And then came the letters. For decades, a cache of correspondence between Sir John Kerr and Buckingham Palace remained sealed in Australia's National Archives. The public couldn't read them. Historians couldn't study them. The official reason? They were personal letters between two individuals, not state documents, and therefore not subject to public release. It was an elegant little loophole, one that happened to protect the monarchy from scrutiny, but academics and journalists didn't let it go. Led by historian Professor Jenny Hocking, a legal battle began to unseal the so-called palace letters. It lasted years. The government resisted. The archives pushed back. The palace said nothing. And then, in 2020, after a landmark ruling by Australia's High Court, the letters were finally made public. The result? A carefully worded, diplomatically restrained smoking gun. While the Queen may not have directly ordered Whitlam's dismissal, the letters revealed that Buckingham Palace was heavily involved in discussions leading up to it. Kerr wrote regularly to the Queen's private secretary, detailing his concerns, his strategy, and even his plan to dismiss the Prime Minister. The palace didn't stop him. In fact, they advised him on how to manage the fallout, how to ensure he'd still be protected by the Queen's good graces even after he pulled the trigger. It wasn't coordination, but it was complicity, and it shattered the long-held belief that the Crown stayed out of democratic affairs. After the letters were released, Buckingham Palace issued no statement, no clarification, no comment. Because what could they say? The Queen had done what she always did, maintained plausible deniability while her office worked behind the scenes. No fingerprints, no signature, just influence, carefully applied and officially unacknowledged. The 1975 dismissal remains one of the most controversial episodes in Australia's political history. But the real legacy of the palace letters is what they revealed about the monarchy itself. That even the most ceremonial institutions can wield extraordinary power when no one's looking. And with that, our list of 33 royal cover-ups comes full circle, spanning centuries of hidden truths, missing records, and smiling denials. In the world of British royalty, silence is policy, history is malleable, and the only thing more sacred than the crown is the version of events it approves for public consumption.